Hello guys, welcome to The Fiction World. Today we have an incredible story for you. What if Deku became immortal vampire overlord and turned Momo, Jiro and Midnight into breeding brides? If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, The Boy Who Drowned and Read the Raid was supposed to be clean. That was what the mission briefing had said, clean, contained, surgical. A mid-tier villain cell operating out of a condemned textile factory on the outskirts of Muzutafu, 43 confirmed hostages, estimated 12 to 15 combatants with non-lethal quirks. Standard UA joint operation, third-year students providing support while pro-heroes handled primary engagement. Aizawa had said it twice, specifically to Midoriya, specifically while looking at him with those flat, tired eyes that meant don't do anything stupid. Izuku had nodded seriously both times. That was 3 hours ago. Before anyone knew the factory had a sublevel. Before anyone knew the villain cell had tripled overnight, because this wasn't a mid-tier operation at all, it was a staging ground, a trap built specifically for the hero response that would inevitably come. Before the sublevel opened up like a jaw and swallowed half the response team, and before Izuku Midoriya found himself alone in the dark with something that didn't have a name in any villain database he'd ever memorized. He could hear the fighting above him, muffled concussions, distant shouting, the sharp crack of Bakugo's explosions working through 3 floors of reinforced concrete. He could hear Momo's voice at one point, crisp and commanding even through the chaos, directing the rescue formation they drilled last semester. He could hear Jiro's heartbeat sonar pinging through the walls, mapping the sublevel in real time and feeding it back to the team upstairs. He could hear all of it, and none of it could help him right now. The thing in front of him had once been a man. Izuku could tell because it still stood upright, still wore the remnants of clothing, still moved with something resembling intention. But whatever quirk had been applied to it, whatever combination of enhancement and modification the villain cell had been cooking down here in the dark, it had pushed well past the point where the word man applied comfortably. It was 7 feet of knotted muscle and rage, skin that had hardened into something between flesh and stone, and it moved with the specific terrible speed of something that had stopped feeling pain entirely. Izuku had hit it with 45% one for all 3 times. The third time, it had caught his fist. He felt the bones in his hand go before he heard them, a sequence of small catastrophic pops traveling up through his wrist and into his forearm. He had time to register the pain, bright, clarifying, the kind that sharpened the world to a single point, and then the thing threw him, and the world became a horizontal blur of concrete and shadow until the far wall ended his flight with a sound that he felt more than heard. He lay there for a moment, breathing. Get up, he told himself. The voice in his head sounded like All Might, like Aizawa, like his mother, like every person who had ever believed in him layered together into something that sounded almost like certainty. Get up. People are counting on you. He got up. His right arm was ruined from the elbow down, he could see the shape of it was wrong even in the low emergency lighting, bent at an angle that arms don't bend. His ribs on the left side were either cracked or broken, each breath a small negotiation. There was blood in his mouth from where he'd bitten his cheek, and something warm was running freely from his hairline down the side of his face. He got up anyway. The enhanced creature turned toward him with that terrible, patient slowness of things that have learned they don't need to hurry. Behind it, Izuku could see the generator it was guarding, a massive, humming piece of machinery that Jiro's sonar had identified as the power source for whatever signal dampener was killing their communications. Destroy it, and the team upstairs would have coordinates. Backup would come. The hostages in the far end of the sublevel, the ones he could hear crying softly in the dark, would make it out. Simple math. He just had to get past the thing that had already broken him twice. He pushed one for all to 60% and felt his bones creak in protest. His right arm screamed. He pushed to 65% and the world went briefly white at the edges. He had done more than this before, had pushed to 100% on the edge of consciousness and held on through sheer stubbornness, but those times he'd had 2 working arms and a plan that extended past hit it until it stops. He charged. The creature moved to meet him, and for 1/2 second Izuku saw the gap, left side, where the hardened skin thinned over a joint, where he'd tagged it before and made it flinch. His left arm came up, one for all screaming through the muscle, and he drove everything he had into that single point. The creature's other hand came from nowhere and took him across the chest. He felt the ribs that had just been cracked become ribs that were broken, felt the air leave him in a single involuntary explosion, felt his feet leave the ground again. He had a brief, crystalline moment of flight, the emergency light strobing above him, the crying of the hostages somewhere in the dark, the distant percussion of Bakugo's rage 3 floors up, and then he hit something that wasn't the wall. It was a support column. Structural, load-bearing. The column cracked. Izuku Midoriya fell through the crack between consciousness and the dark below it, and the sublevel's ceiling began, slowly, to come down. He heard the hostages scream. He tried to move and found that the instructions he was sending his body were not being received. He could feel his heartbeat, fast, then faster, then irregular in a way that scared him more than the pain did, and he thought, very clearly, with the specific clarity that only comes at the end of things, I didn't save them. The ceiling came down. The dark was not empty. He had expected nothing. He'd thought, in the abstract philosophical way you think about things you're not ready to think about directly, that death would be like the moment before sleep, a gentle dissolve, a trailing off. He had not expected the dark to be warm, or to have a texture, or to press against him with the focused attention of something alive. Something was in the dark with him. It was old. He understood that immediately, the way you understand certain things in dreams without being told, a knowing that arrives complete, without the journey of discovery. Old in a way that made everything he knew, every piece of history he'd ever absorbed, every story about the origins of quirks and the deep past of human civilization, feel like recent news. Old in a way that suggested it had been here, in this particular dark, long before the concept of here existed. It was looking at him. You, it said, though it didn't speak. The word arrived inside him the way sound arrives inside a tuning fork, not heard so much as resonated. Izuku, even dying, even dissolved into whatever this was, found that his mind was still running. Still cataloging, still analyzing, still reaching for context where there wasn't any. The habit of a lifetime, the compulsive note-taking that had survived every broken bone, every failed attempt, every moment someone told him he'd never be enough. What are you? He thought back, because he didn't know how else to communicate. The presence considered this. It felt like the turning of something enormous, tectonic, vast, unhurried. The oldest answer, it said. The thing that waits at the bottom of all hunger. That's not very specific. Something moved in the dark that might have been amusement. You are remarkable, it said. Everything this world has tried to grind down, and still, this. Still reaching for a notebook. I don't have a notebook. You always have a notebook. And somehow that was the truest thing anyone had ever said to him, and somehow hearing it from this ancient, nameless darkness made him feel less afraid than he had any right to be. You're dying, it said. The warmth of the dark pressed closer. The body is finished. The heart has decided. But the will, and here it paused with something that felt almost like reverence, the will refuses. I have not felt a will refuse death like this in 2,000 years. Izuku understood, then, what was being offered. Not for free, he said. He'd read enough stories to know. Nothing like this is ever for free. No, it agreed. You would carry me. And I would make you something the world has never properly seen. The power you borrowed? That was a fraction. What I offer has no fraction. It is whole, and it is permanent, and it is yours, but you would not be what you were. Would I still be me? The pause was the longest yet. More you, it said finally, than you have ever been allowed to be. Above him, above the dark, above death, he could hear the hostages. Still crying. Still alive, which meant the ceiling hadn't fully come down yet, which meant there was still time if someone got up and went to them. Yes, he said. The dark swallowed him completely. Then it gave him back. The first thing Izuku Midoriya was aware of, in his second life, was sound. Not the muffled, limited sound of a human body with human ears. This was something altogether different, a full-spectrum torrent of information that arrived all at once and took approximately 2 seconds to parse and organize before his new mind filed it into coherence. He heard the hostages, 41 of them, the other 2 had gotten out, heard their heartbeats individually, distinct as fingerprints, heard the specific rhythm of panic versus the deeper thud of shock versus the thin rapid flutter of a child who needed immediate medical attention. He heard the structural groaning of the damaged sublevel, could calculate from the sound alone which columns were critical and which had give left. He heard the fighting upstairs winding down, the sharp announcements of heroes securing rooms, and underneath all of it, clear as a bell even through 3 floors of concrete, Momo's voice, directing the medical team toward the sublevel entrance. Midoriya's tracker went offline down there, he went in alone. He sat up. The rubble that had buried him shifted and fell away like it weighed nothing, which, he realized with a distant kind of wonder, it essentially did now. He looked at his right arm, the one that had been bent wrong, the one with the broken bones, and watched, with no particular surprise, as the last of the damage finished closing. Skin over knit bone, clean and fast, like watching a time-lapse of healing compressed into seconds. He flexed his fingers. Perfect. He stood up. The sublevel was dimly lit but he didn't need the light, which was interesting. He could see in the infrared signatures of living things, every person in the room a distinct bloom of warmth in the dark. The enhanced creature was still standing, had turned toward him with that heavy, patient attention, clearly confused that the broken thing on the floor had become a standing thing in the shadows. Izuku looked at it. He understood his body now in a way he never had before, understood it the way a musician understands an instrument they've played for decades, every capability known and mapped and ready. The power in him was not one for all's crackling, lightning-threaded surge, not the borrowed weight of predecessors stacked behind him. This was native. This was his. It didn't surge or crackle. It simply existed, absolute and quiet, the way gravity simply exists. He walked toward the creature. It charged him, that full, thundering charge that had broken him twice, that same terrible speed, the same hardened fists coming in with enough force to reduce a car to abstract sculpture. Izuku watched it come and did not move until the last possible moment, and then he moved in a way that the word fast doesn't really cover, because it wasn't that he moved quickly so much as he was simply in a different position than expected, one hand at the creature's throat, feet planted. He stopped it. All 7 feet and God knows how many kilos of enhanced momentum, stopped with one hand and planted feet, with no visible effort at all. The creature made a sound. A new sound. It had been silent before, all this time, but now it made a sound that was small and confused and almost pitiable. Izuku held its gaze. His eyes, he didn't know yet, had changed, the green had deepened to something that was green the way deep ocean water is green, and they caught the emergency lighting in a way that living eyes don't quite catch it. "Go to sleep," he said. He hadn't known he was going to say it. Hadn't known it would work. But the effect was immediate and absolute, the creature's eyes rolled back, the tension went out of it like air from a punctured thing, and it folded to the ground in a heap that was somehow graceful, the way all things are graceful when they stop fighting. Izuku turned from it and looked at the generator. He didn't punch it. He pressed his palm flat against its casing and felt for the specific current of the signal dampener, found it, a tight, purposeful electromagnetic pattern, and simply inverted it. He wasn't sure how he knew how to do that. He suspected he was going to be finding out how he knew how to do that for quite some time. The generator hummed and went quiet. Somewhere above him, 40 communications devices woke up simultaneously. He heard the hostages before he saw them. They'd pressed themselves as far back into the sublevel as possible during the fight, a cluster of bodies against the far wall, terrified and silent. He walked toward them and they flinched, understandably, because what walked toward them out of the dark was not exactly reassuring in appearance, tall, blood-dried, eyes wrong, moving with a fluidity that didn't match the shape of him. "It's okay," he said, and then, because he was still Izuku Midoriya at the absolute core of himself, because that had not changed and would not change. I've got you. Everyone's going to be okay. Can anyone walk? Most of them could. He assessed the ones who couldn't, the child with the rapid flutter heartbeat needed to be carried, and organized them in about 45 seconds with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 3 years learning rescue formations. He moved to the front, picked up the child without drama, and led them toward the sublevel stairs. The child looked up at him from the crook of his arm. Small face, wide eyes, the specific gravity of someone who has just survived something they don't have words for yet. "Are you a vampire?" the child asked. Izuku opened his mouth to say no, obviously, "Don't be silly." "I don't know yet," he said instead, which was the truest answer he had, and led them all into the light. Midnight saw him first. She had been stationed at the sublevel entrance, nominally managing the triage area, actually managing the barely contained panic of 2 senior heroes and 4 third-year students who had been listening to silence from Midoriya's tracker for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. 6 minutes was a long time to listen to silence from a tracker. Long enough for faces to do things people were trying to control. She was good at reading rooms. Always had been. It was part of what made her effective in a fight and, if she was being honest, part of what made her dangerous in a different kind of way, that capacity to read the current of a situation and know exactly what to do with it. So when the sublevel door opened and the shape of Izuku Midoriya stepped through it, she registered him in layers. First layer, he's alive. Relief so sharp it almost embarrassed her. Second layer, he has a child in his arms and a line of civilians behind him. Pride, immediate and uncomplicated. Third layer, arriving last and staying longest, something is wrong with his eyes. Not wrong the way injury was wrong. Not the unfocused drift of a concussion or the glassy quality of shock. Just, different. He moved through the doorway and straightened up to his full height, which seemed, somehow, to be more than she'd remembered it being, and he looked around the triage area with those changed eyes and absorbed everything in the room in a single sweep the way predators absorb clearings, complete, instant, nothing missed. His gaze found hers. Held it for exactly a second. Something in her chest did a thing she chose not to name. 41 civilians, he said, his voice calm and carrying in a way she'd never heard from him before. He'd always been a bit of a rambler, warm but tumbling, ideas tripping over each other to get out. This was different. This was the voice of someone who knew exactly what they were saying and exactly how much space it needed. One child needs immediate medical attention, possible cardiac event from the stress. Tracker on the enhanced combatant, it's down but secured, no lethal force required. The signal dampener's been disabled. He passed the child to the nearest medic without being asked, assessed the medic's grip with one glance, apparently decided it was sufficient, and stepped aside to let the civilian stream through. Aizawa appeared from his left, and Izuku turned to meet him before Aizawa was fully in his eye line, turned at the sound of his footsteps, or his heartbeat, or something that wasn't either of those things. Aizawa stopped. His face did the flattest, most controlled version of what was still clearly a double take. Midoriya. Aizawa-sensei. Your arm was broken. He said it like a statement that was asking to be a question. Yes. It isn't now. No. Silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, it's full of things being very carefully assessed. Aizawa was still for about 4 seconds, which was a long time for him, and Izuku held the stillness back without fidgeting, without rushing to fill it, without any of the nervous energy that had always been his most consistent characteristic. Midnight watched Aizawa's eyes flick to the sublevel door, then to the civilians being processed, then back to Izuku. We're going to talk, Aizawa said. I know, Izuku said. Then Bakugo came through from the north corridor. He didn't enter so much as arrive, his entries had always had a kinetic quality, like he was considering blowing up the doorframe as a statement and was being restrained by mild inconvenience. He was furious, which was close enough to his default state that it was hard to read the specific flavor of it until he locked onto Izuku and crossed the room with a directed intent that made two support staff get out of his way without being told. "You absolute idiot," Bakugo said, and his voice had that quality it only got when he was furious and scared simultaneously, the two things mixing into something that came out as heat. "Your tracker went dark. 6 minutes, Deku." "What the?" He stopped. 3 feet away, close enough for the details to matter, and Midnight watched his red eyes trace the same path hers had, the dried blood on the face that should have indicated significant injury but didn't, the posture, the eyes. Bakugo Katsuki was not, generally, a person who went quiet. He went quiet. "What," he said, flatly, "happened to you?" "I died," Izuku said, with a kind of simple directness that hit the room like a dropped weight. "And then I didn't." "That's not, you can't just," Bakugo made a sound of complete frustration and pointed one gloved finger at him. "You're going to explain that?" "Yes," Izuku said again. "Right now. When there's time. The mission's not finished." And he turned, just slightly, to look at the last 2 corridors still being cleared, and Midnight saw 2 of the heroes on the perimeter move, instinctively, without instruction, angling toward the corridors as if redirected by gravity, and then stop, looking mildly confused about why they'd moved. She narrowed her eyes. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't spoken to them or gestured or made any visible command. But there had been something in the quality of his attention, some directional weight to the way he'd looked at those corridors, and people had responded to it. She tucked that away, very carefully, next to the thing about his eyes and the way his voice had changed and the fact that he'd stopped an enhanced super soldier with one hand and walked 41 civilians out of a collapsed sublevel without a scratch. Momo arrived from the east stairwell at a controlled run that she'd clearly been fighting not to make a sprint, her creation board still active, a first aid pack in her hands that she clearly no longer needed for what she'd been anticipating. She saw the civilians. She saw Izuku standing whole in the middle of the triage area. She made the same inventory pass that Midnight had made, faster because Momo's mind worked faster than almost anyone gave it credit for, and when she reached the eyes she simply stopped. Mid-step. Arrested. Her mouth opened. "Midoriya," she said, and the word had a strange quality, like it was the question and the answer simultaneously. He looked at her. "Hey, Yaoyorozu," he said, and the warmth in it was so recognizably him, so unchanged, so straightforwardly there, that it seemed to Midnight to be almost the most unsettling thing about all of this. Because the warmth was real. He hadn't become cold, or distant, or detached in the way that power usually detaches people. The warmth was real and it was backed, now, by something enormous. Momo swallowed. Squared her shoulders in that way she had that meant she was processing very fast and very quietly. "You're not injured," she said. "No. You were." Her voice was steady. Her eyes weren't, quite. "Yes." She looked at the first aid pack in her hands and set it down on the nearest surface with the specific care of someone who needs something physical to do. "We should do a full medical. I'm not injured," he said again, gently. "But I'd like to talk to you. After." The after had a weight to it that Midnight recognized, not a threat, not urgency exactly, but an intention so clear it had mass. "Okay," Momo said, which was not the response Midnight expected from her. Momo was not someone who said okay to ambiguous requests without asking for parameters. But she said it quietly, and she held his gaze for another moment before looking away. Jiro came down last from the upper floors, headphone jacks retracting, the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been running their quirk at full capacity for 2 hours settling into her expression. She almost walked into Izuku because she was looking at her phone and he was standing in the middle of the floor. She looked up. She was close enough that she would have had no choice but to see his eyes, close enough that when the ambient hum of him hit her, and it was a hum, Midnight was almost sure of it, subsonic, the kind of frequency Jiro would hear before anyone else, she went slightly rigid. "Midoriya," she said. "Jiro. She stopped. Her dark eyes moved over him with the careful attention of someone whose whole relationship to the world was mediated through sound and frequency, and Midnight watched something cross her face that wasn't fear and wasn't quite awe but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. You sound different, Jiro said finally. He smiled, just slightly. I know. Different how, Bakugo said, voice dangerously flat, still a few feet away, arms crossed, refusing to be unnerved by the thing that was clearly unnerving him. Jiro opened her mouth and closed it again. Then, like a chord that didn't resolve before. And now it has. She said it like she didn't entirely mean to say it, like it had come out before she'd decided to let it. She looked briefly irritated at herself in the way she did when she'd said something that came out more vulnerable than intended. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Izuku said, let's finish the sweep, and everyone moved, and it was only after the triage area had dissolved into purposeful motion that Midnight realized she'd moved too, automatically, as if she'd been included in the everyone, and she was a pro-hero, a senior pro-hero, and he was a student, and she'd moved like it was the most natural thing in the world. She stood very still for a moment in the middle of the organized chaos. Well, she thought. They took him for medical evaluation afterward, because of course they did, protocol required it, and Aizawa was not someone who let protocol bend, not even for things that defied it. The medical team documented his lack of injuries with the specific professional calm of people who were deeply unsettled and trained not to show it. Blood work came back inconclusive in ways that made the doctor read the results twice. His temperature was low. Not dangerously, not clinically, just low. His heart rate was slow and even in a way that clocks don't manage. He sat on the examination table and answered questions with patient honesty, and when the doctor asked what had happened in the sublevel, he said he didn't know exactly, and it was true enough. Midnight observed from the doorway. She'd told herself she was there for oversight, she was the senior pro on scene, it was appropriate for her to observe the medical evaluation of a student. She was observing. She was also watching him for the same reason you watch something that used to be a familiar landscape and has shifted, not to see if it's dangerous, but because the shift itself is so complete that you can't look away. He caught her watching. Of course he did. He looked up from the blood pressure cuff with those ocean green eyes and held her gaze across the examination room, and the look was not challenging or provocative, it was just aware, the kind of awareness that saw her completely, that registered Namuri Kayama and not just Midnight, and didn't do anything with that seeing except acknowledge it. She lifted an eyebrow. Subtle. The kind of thing she'd use in a negotiation, I see you seeing me, and I'm not concerned. The corner of his mouth moved. A fraction. Something that, in a different register, might be called a smile. She looked away first. It was possible, she thought, walking down the corridor away from the examination room and the strangely charged air inside it, entirely possible that what had come back from that sublevel was going to be the most interesting problem she had encountered in a career built on interesting problems. Outside the facility, the night was cold and clean, and 3 of the Hero Response Team's vehicles were still parked in the factory lot, and the lights of Mizutofu glittered in the distance, and Namuri Kayama stood in the cold air and thought about deep green eyes and a voice that carried like a bell and the word after with weight in it. She thought about all of those things. Get it together, she told herself, and went to file her incident report, and tried not to think about how the space in the doorway still felt warm even though he wasn't standing in it anymore. They released him to the UA dorms at 2 a.m. Aizawa walked with him, not quite an escort, not quite surveillance, the exact ambiguous middle ground that Aizawa occupied as naturally as breathing. They walked in silence for a while. The campus was quiet at this hour, just wind through the trees along the path and the distant sound of the city doing its nighttime thing. You're going to tell me, Aizawa said. Not a question. Yes, Izuku said. I just need a day. Maybe 2. Why? Because I'm still figuring out what I'm telling you. He paused. I'm not a threat to the students. I know you're not a threat to the students, Midoriya, I've been watching you all night. I'm concerned about you. Izuku stopped walking. Aizawa stopped 2 steps ahead, turned back, and Izuku was looking at him with something complicated in his face, gratitude, maybe, or the specific emotion that doesn't have a good name, the one you feel when someone's concern lands exactly where it was aimed. He thought about it genuinely. I'm better than I've ever been. That's not reassurance. That's just accurate. Aizawa looked at him for a long moment. I know, he said finally, which was not what Izuku expected, and walked on. Izuku stood in the path for a second, watching him go. I know. He filed that away with everything else. He looked up at the night sky. No moon tonight, just stars and the distant orange glow of the city, and he could see everything, the individual leaves on the tree above the path, the specific pattern of lit windows in the dormitory, a hawk sitting motionless on the roof of the support course building 300 meters away. He took a breath. The air was full of information, cold concrete, cut grass, a dozen distinct human scents from the dorm that he was already learning to separate and identify. The world was extraordinarily detailed. He had never understood how much he was missing before. He took another breath, and this one caught something that made him pause, something underneath the cold and the green and the dorm smell, something particular, warm and precise and somehow, already important to him. 2 of the lights in the dorm above him were still on. He knew, without deciding to know, which rooms they were. He let himself into the building, walked the quiet hallway, and went to his room. He didn't sleep. He sat on the floor with his back against the bed, which was how he thought best, and he began, in the silence, the methodical work of understanding what he had become. He thought about the dark. He thought about the warmth of it, the voice of it, the ancient presence that had made him a vessel for something older than every hero and villain in history he'd ever known. He thought about Momo's face when she'd said okay. He thought about Jiro's voice when she'd said like a chord that resolved. He thought about midnight in the doorway, watching him with those sharp, knowing eyes that had spent a lifetime reading rooms and had clearly found something in this one that required a second reading. After, he had said. He had meant it. The night deepened around him, and Izuku Midoriya, the vampire overlord, the boy who had drowned in red and come back as something the world didn't have a category for yet, sat in the quiet and thought, with the focused patience of something that now had all the time in the world, about what came next. Chapter 2, Queen of Creation. He came to her at dusk. Not the middle of the night, not some dramatically timed hour designed to be unsettling, dusk, specifically, when the UA campus was transitioning from the organized noise of the day into the quieter rhythms of evening, when people were returning to dorms and winding down and the common spaces had that comfortable, lived-in looseness to them. He came to her door at dusk because he'd spent the entire day thinking about timing and had decided that showing up like he was trying to be mysterious would be exactly the wrong note. Momo had her door open. She usually did in the early evening. It was a small signal she gave without thinking about it, left over from first year when Jiro had explained to her, gently, that a perpetually closed door read as "Don't bother me," and Momo had been horrified because that was the opposite of what she wanted. So she left it open, and usually the open door meant the comfortable background noise of dorm life drifting in while she worked, Kaminari's laugh from somewhere down the hall, the smell of whatever Sato was doing in the kitchen. She was at her desk working through a tactical analysis she'd been assigned, a real one, not a classroom exercise, a post-mission review of last night's operation that Aizawa had handed her this morning with the specific deliberateness of someone who was giving her something to occupy her hands while other things processed. She was 3 pages in and had been staring at the same paragraph for 11 minutes. She heard Izuku's footsteps before he appeared in the doorway. She'd learned his footstep pattern years ago, the particular rhythm of someone who walked like they were always about to start running, but these were different. Same pace, same stride length, but the weight distribution had changed, and there was no sound of the slight scuffing drag on the left foot that happened when he was tired. She had not consciously known she knew this much about how Izuku Midoriya walked, and discovering it now, when the information became suddenly relevant, was mildly embarrassing. He knocked on the open door anyway. Which was, she thought, very him. "Hey," he said. She turned from the desk. He was in plain clothes, dark sweatshirt, dark pants, no armor, no gear, and he filled the doorway differently than he used to. Not in size, particularly, though he'd always been broader through the shoulders than his general demeanor suggested. In presence. In the way the light in the hallway seemed to acknowledge him. "Hey," she said back. He tilted his head toward the hallway, a wordless question. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, picked up the blazer from the back of her chair, an automatic gesture, the habit of someone who'd been taught that being presentable was a form of respect, and followed him out. They walked to the roof. It was Momo's favorite thinking space, which he knew because she'd mentioned it exactly once in first year, and she was mildly startled that he remembered, and then not startled at all because this was Midoriya and he had always remembered things like that, had always catalogued the details of the people around him with a thoroughness that everyone benefited from and nobody quite thought to name. The roof was empty. The sky over Mizutafu was doing that particular thing it did on clear evenings in late autumn, the purple-blue of the zenith bleeding down through layers of color toward the orange smear of the city on the horizon. It was cold. Momo didn't mind cold. She leaned against the railing and looked at him. He stood a few feet away, forearms on the rail, looking at the city, and she spent a moment doing what she'd been doing all day when she wasn't staring at that paragraph, looking at him carefully, with the full attention she brought to problems that mattered. "You didn't sleep," she said. He glanced at her. "No. Did you need to?" A pause. "I don't know yet." He seemed to find this genuinely interesting rather than alarming. "I've been running tests on myself all day. Internal ones. Documenting." He turned slightly. "Old habits. What have you found?" "That I should probably get a new notebook. A bigger one." He said it with the quiet humor of someone making peace with a large thing through small observations, and she felt something ease in her chest that had been wound tight since last night. "Tell me," she said. Not a demand, an offering. The particular kind of listening she could do when she chose, complete and unhurried. So he told her. He told her about the sublevel, about the fight, about the specific sequence of breaking that had landed him past the point of return. He told her about the dark and the presence in it, about the warmth and the voice and the negotiation, and she listened without interrupting, which she was good at, and her mind was moving very fast and very quietly through everything he said, building the model, finding the shape of it. He told her about waking up, about the sound and the sight and the instinctive knowledge of his own capabilities arriving complete, and she watched his face while he talked and saw something that she wouldn't have known to look for before last night. He wasn't afraid of any of it. Not performing calm. Not suppressing fear beneath composure. Genuinely, simply not afraid. "The creature," she said, when he described stopping it. "The enhanced combatant. You said you told it to sleep." "Yes. That's a form of mental influence." "Yes. And the heroes in the triage area moved toward the corridors when you looked at them." He went still for a fraction of a second, which she noted. "You saw that." "I see most things," she said, without pride, just as information. He looked at her. The evening light did what the emergency lighting had done last night, caught in his eyes in a way that made the green luminous in a manner that wasn't optical, exactly, more fundamental than optics. "I didn't mean to do that," he said. "The heroes. I need to learn the control." "But you don't regret the capability." "No," he said simply. "I don't." She nodded slowly, and in the silence she organized everything she'd heard into the shape it made, and the shape was large and unprecedented and should, by every conventional metric, be frightening. She catalogued the fear somewhere distant and kept looking at him. "Why me first?" she asked. "Why are you telling me this first?" He turned to face her properly, and the directness of it, the complete, undeflected attention, was something she'd never quite received from him before, or from anyone, really. People looked at Momo Yaoyorozu and saw the family name, or the creation quirk, or the grades, or any number of things that circled the outline of her without quite landing on the center. He was looking at the center. "Because you won't panic," he said. And because you'll tell me if I'm wrong about something. And because, he paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that was honest in the slightly uncomfortable way of things being said out loud for the first time. Because I've been thinking about you specifically since last night. About what I want to say to you. And I've been thinking about it more than I've thought about anything else today, and I decided that probably meant I should come here first instead of second-guessing it into nothing. The honesty of that landed with a weight that she felt in her sternum. Momo was good at many things. She had been comprehensively trained in tactics and leadership and the management of difficult situations, and she had, over 3 years at UA, become quite good at managing her own reactions in those situations. But this particular category of thing, being looked at like that, being told something like that, by someone who meant it without performance or strategy, was a gap in her training that she was becoming acutely aware of. What, she said, very carefully, are you saying exactly? He didn't hedge. I'm saying that what happened to me last night changed the scope of almost everything. What I can do, what I'll need, what I want. And I'm saying that when I was sitting in my room last night thinking about all of it, you were in the picture. I was in the picture. You and Jiro. And, a slight pause, midnight. The name midnight arrived with enough weight that Momo felt the breath she hadn't realized she was holding release slowly. Midnight, she repeated. Yes. She turned back to the railing and looked at the city. A long moment passed. She was doing what she did when the problem was genuinely complicated, building the map slowly, each variable in its place, not rushing to conclusions. And by in the picture, she said, you mean? I mean exactly what you think I mean. His voice was level and warm and absolutely certain. But I need you to understand that I'm not telling you this because of what I've become or what it can do. I'm telling you because I should have told you something like it before last night. And last night clarified very quickly what I'd been taking too long to say. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you realize that's an enormous amount to put in front of a person. I know. You also realize I have approximately 40 follow-up questions. Something loosened in him, she saw it, the slight release in the set of his shoulders, and the almost smile appeared, brief and real. I know that too. She turned toward him. All right. Tell me what this actually means. Not emotionally, I'll get to that. Tell me mechanically. What does it mean to be what you are, and what does in the picture mean in that context? If he was surprised by the pivot to logistics, he didn't show it. He answered her the way she'd asked, clearly, with the specific organized clarity of someone who'd been thinking all day and had his information sorted. The vampiric nature of what had claimed him, not the folklore version, not the cinematic version, but the actual reality as he'd spent the day testing and understanding it. The strength, the speed, the sensory range. The influence, nascent, still being mapped. The fact that he didn't burn in sunlight, which had been his first test at 6 a.m. and had produced nothing except confirmation that he could apparently stand in a beam of morning light indefinitely. The sun was fine, he said. I think the folklore built up around the sensitivity to light over time, maybe older vampires, maybe different bloodlines, I genuinely don't know yet. There's a lot I don't know yet. But the fundamental nature of the transformation is permanent. Yes. And it was the entity in the dark that offered it, not One for All. One for All is still there, he said, and she heard the genuine surprise still present in it. It didn't replace it. It's layered underneath. Like a foundation that now has a building on it. She absorbed this. And what you want from me? He held her gaze. I want you to be mine. Completely. If you choose it. He didn't soften it or dress it up. Not because I'm compelling you and not because you owe me anything. Because I'm asking, and because I think you've been waiting for someone to ask you like this, directly, fully, like you're the exact right answer to a question and not a convenient addition to something else. The accuracy of that was so precise that it almost hurt. She had spent a very long time being a convenient addition to things. The best in the class who was available to help the others catch up. The one with the practical quirk. The vice president. The reliable one. She was loved, she knew she was loved, but there was a difference between being loved and being chosen, and she understood in this moment that she had been quietly aware of that difference for years. If I say yes, she said, what happens to me? You'd be bonded to me. I don't know everything that means yet, I'm going to be honest about that, I'm not going to tell you more than I know. But I know the bond would change you physically. Stronger, faster. Some of what I can sense, you'd share. You'd be mine, in a way that has weight. In a way that I'd feel and you'd feel. Would I become a vampire? No. Something different. Something that has its own name that I haven't found yet. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the last of the color drained out of the western sky and the stars began to assert themselves over the orange glow of the city. He waited. He didn't shift or prompt or fill the silence with reassurance, he simply waited, with that new patience that had no bottom to it, and she understood that he would wait for as long as she needed. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent at UA. She thought about every battle where she'd run the numbers and made the hard calls and put herself where she needed to be. She thought about the first time she'd seen him use one for all and felt that specific, complicated thing, not envy, nothing so small as envy, but a recognition of a frequency she didn't have words for. She thought about last night. About saying okay and meaning it in a way that had startled her. She thought about the way he'd said you were in the picture, not I noticed you or I've been thinking about asking you out or any of the comfortable, small-scaled language of ordinary things. In the picture. As if the picture were vast and she'd been in it all along and he'd simply needed to become large enough to show it to her. She turned to face him fully. I have 2 conditions, she said. He waited. First, I want full transparency. Everything you learn about what you are, what this bond means, what it changes, you tell me. I'm not interested in being protected from information. Agreed, he said immediately. Second, the others. Jiro and Midnight. She held his eyes steadily. If this is what you're building, then it needs to be built honestly. No one is told less than the truth. No one is kept in the dark. A beat. Including about each other. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could see him thinking, genuinely, not performing consideration. Then, agreed. Yes. That's how it should be. She nodded once. Then yes, she said. I choose it. He moved toward her, and she didn't step back, and when he reached out and touched her face, one hand, palm against her jaw, thumb barely brushing her cheekbone, it was the most deliberate, attentive gesture she had ever been on the receiving end of. He looked at her with those deep-sea eyes for a moment, and she looked back, and the world was very still. Then she felt it. Not pain, nothing like pain. More like a key turning in a lock that she hadn't known existed. Something in her chest opened with a feeling like the first breath after being underwater too long, and warmth moved through her from that opening point outward to her extremities, and for a moment everything was extraordinarily vivid. The sound of the city below. The cold air on her skin. The individual threads of his sweatshirt under her fingertips, she hadn't noticed she'd reached for him, but she had, both hands gripping the front of his sweatshirt like an anchor. The warmth settled. The vividness calibrated itself to something sustainable, and she stood in it and took stock of herself with the careful internal assessment that was as natural to her as breathing. She was still herself. Completely, thoroughly, entirely herself. She was also, more. More was the only word for it. Like a room she'd been living in her whole life had just revealed that it had another wing. She exhaled slowly. Oh, she said. He was watching her with an expression she'd seen from him exactly once before, the night of the joint training exercise in second year, when her plan had worked exactly as designed and for one moment he'd looked at her like he was seeing something that delighted him all the way down. Are you all right? She took another breath and assessed further. My hearing is different. Yes. I can hear the street from here. She paused, that's 4 blocks. I can hear individual conversations. It'll calibrate, he said. The first few hours can be overwhelming. I'm not overwhelmed, she said, with a slight precision that might have been primness in a different key but was actually just accuracy. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was interested. She turned, slightly, and looked at the city with her new hearing and her new eyes. The colors were richer in the low light, the detail finer, the whole panorama of Muzutafu sharper and more present than it had ever been. Then she looked back at him and something occurred to her. My quirk, she said. She held out her hand, focused, and created, not the small, simple objects she used when conserving energy, but something specific, something that had always been at the edge of her capabilities. A compound polymer structure, multi-layered, the kind of thing that usually required concentration and a full minute of metabolic investment. It formed in 4 seconds. Perfect, complete, and it had cost her approximately nothing. She stared at it. The lipid conversion process, she said, mostly to herself, the scientist in her already running ahead. If the bond accelerated my metabolic efficiency, then my creation capacity isn't being limited by output cost anymore, it's being limited by, she looked up. Midoriya. My quirk is limited by my metabolic rate. If that rate has changed, then the limit has changed, he said, and he was watching her with that same delighted expression, clearly having waited for her to arrive at this specific realization because he'd known she would and he'd wanted to see it. She put the polymer structure down on the railing. She created a tactical blade. Full-length, combat-grade alloy composition, edge geometry she'd had to practice for 2 years to produce consistently. 3 seconds. No cost she could meaningfully feel. She looked at Izuku Midoriya. That's going to change my capabilities significantly, she said. I know. In combat. In support. Strategically, the implications are extensive. Yes. He smiled, and it was real and warm and carried none of the condescension that intelligence sometimes generates in people who have it. I've been looking forward to seeing what you do with it. Something bloomed in her chest, the warm thing that had arrived with the bond, but also something older and more specifically hers, something that was just Momo Yaoyorozu being told that the things she was capable of were things someone was genuinely looking forward to seeing. She looked at the blade in her hands for a moment, then dissolved it back into component materials. Jiro, she said. Tomorrow, I think, he said. She's going to fight it, Momo said. Not because she doesn't feel it. She's felt something for a long time. She'll fight it because she's built her entire self-concept around not being swept up in things. He was quiet for a moment. I know. I'm not going to push her. You won't need to, Momo said. She'll come to you. She just needs to do it in her own direction. She glanced at him. Don't interpret her resistance as rejection. It isn't. He absorbed this. You know her better than I do. I know her differently than you do. She paused. You know what she sounds like. I know what she sounds like when she's trying not to be heard. He smiled again. That's going to be very useful. She should have found the useful clinical or cold. She didn't. Because the way he said it meant you are specifically, exactly, irreplaceably useful, not as a resource, as a person who was present and whole and known. Midnight, she said, moving to the next item with the efficiency that was her natural rhythm. Something more complicated moved through his expression. That one's going to take a different approach. She's a pro-hero and a teacher, Momo said. Professionally she has to treat you as a student. Any other context is complicated for her. I know. She's also, Momo considered how to say what she'd observed about Midnight over 3 years of observation that she'd never told anyone. She performs confidence so consistently that people mistake the performance for the person. She would respond very badly to being seen through that performance by someone she couldn't easily categorize. You think she'd respond badly to honesty? I think she'd respond interestingly to honesty, Momo corrected. And then well, eventually. But interestingly first. Interestingly, he repeated. I mean she'd probably say something scathing and try to take control of the conversation. That's manageable. Momo looked at him. Is it? For me? Yes. He said it without arrogance, simple statement of fact, the same tone he'd used to confirm that water was wet. She was beginning to understand that this was going to be one of the more interesting features of the new Izuku, not the power, not the capabilities, but the absence of the doubt that had always run underneath everything. He had been brave before while doubting everything. Now he was simply, certain. It was, she decided, a very good look on him. There's something else, she said. I know, he said. The people who will see this as a threat. She nodded. The Pale Court. She'd been doing research all day, not because she'd known the name before but because she'd started with what she had, mythology, history, fringe academic literature on pre-quirk society, the specific pattern of what the entity he'd described matched, and she'd found the references. Scattered, contradictory, most of them buried in texts that serious scholars didn't cite. But the pattern was there. Ancient vampiric governance structure. They haven't had an overlord in 2,000 years. He looked at her steadily. You found that today. I had 11 hours. When did you sleep? I didn't. She said it with the light unapologetic quality she used for things that she didn't consider worth apologizing for. What do you know about them? Less than you do, apparently. He turned to face the city fully, leaning on the railing, and she watched his expression become thoughtful. The entity gave me instincts and capabilities. It didn't give me a manual. I know they exist. I know they didn't expect the Overlord seat to be claimed, and I know that they're not going to receive it peacefully. Because you're human-born, she said. And young. And untrained by their standards. Will they send someone? Yes. He said it with complete certainty. But not yet. They'll observe first. They'll want to assess what I am before they move. He glanced at her. Which gives us time. She heard the us and noted it, not as a thing to be emotional about right now, but as a structural fact, the way you note a load-bearing element when designing something. Us. The beginning of an architecture. I'll keep researching, she said. I know you will. He said it like it was the most reliable thing in the world, which it was. Don't sacrifice sleep for it. I'll sleep when there's enough information. Yaoyorozu. I'm joking, she said, and then, because the joke was only partly a joke, mostly. He laughed. It was his real laugh, the one that was slightly too loud and entirely unguarded, and it arrived so suddenly and so recognizably his that she felt something shift and settle in her chest, the confirmation of what she'd been quietly checking for since he'd knocked on the open door. The boy who had died in the sublevel and come back as something vast and ancient was still, at the center of the vastness, the same specific person who'd laughed like that at his own enthusiasm since first year. Stay, she said, and then looked mildly surprised at herself for saying it. He looked at her. Not surprised, just measuring, making sure he understood. On the roof, she added, with the slight precision of someone not retreating but clarifying. Just, for a while. Tell me more about what you figured out. I want the full inventory. He settled back against the railing more comfortably, a shift in posture that meant yes without words. She leaned beside him and looked at the city, and she listened with her new hearing to the extraordinary detail of the world at night, and she asked him questions and he answered them, and the conversation moved through everything with the easy, specific energy of two minds that had always fit together well and were only now running in full. Around midnight, actual midnight, the clock on her phone said, she created a blanket without really thinking about it, a simple thing, warm composite material, and threw half of it over her own shoulders and held the other half out to him. He looked at it for a moment. I don't get cold, he said. I know. Take it anyway. He took it. She was going to be honest with herself, since she was now committed to a path that seemed to require it. She had not expected this. She had expected to be moved by what he told her, had expected the pull of it, had expected to say yes with the part of herself that analyzed and concluded. She had not expected to feel, standing on this roof at midnight with the warm hum of the bond in her chest and a borrowed half of a blanket over his shoulder, that she was exactly in the right place. She had not expected it to be comfortable. Not ordinary, nothing about this was ordinary and she didn't want ordinary. But comfortable in the way of things that fit, that have found their proper dimensions. She was Momo Yaoyorozu. She was capable and sharp and had been carrying her own weight for so long she'd stopped noticing it. And here was someone who didn't need her to carry anything, who had asked for her presence and not her utility, who had said you were in the picture with the weight of someone who'd found what they were looking for. She was going to be very good at this, she thought. Whatever this was becoming. She already was, in fact. Below them, the city hummed and breathed, and somewhere in the girls' dormitory 2 floors down and 1 wing over, a light was on in Jiro Kyoka's room, and Momo could hear, with her new ears, the very faint sound of someone playing guitar at low volume, working through the same chord progression over and over with the focused, slightly frustrated energy of someone who was not thinking about the music. She glanced at Izuku. He was looking in that direction already. I heard it, he said quietly. She does that when she's processing something, Momo said. She's been playing that same progression since about 9 o'clock. That's 4 hours. Yes. Silence for a moment. Then Momo said, she'll come to you. You said that already. I'm saying it again because you looked over there like you were thinking about going. He was quiet. Give her the night, Momo said. She needs to arrive at it herself. If you go to her before she's ready, she'll argue. If you let her come to you, she'll still argue, he said. Yes, but it'll be a different kind of arguing. The kind that goes somewhere. He absorbed this, then looked back at the city. I trust your read on her. Good, she said. That's going to continue to be the right call. He smiled, and so did she, and the guitar from Jiro's window worked through its progression again and again in the dark below them, and the stars continued their slow geometry overhead, and the pale court, wherever it was watching from, watched, and the night deepened into the particular quiet that comes after a day when the world has changed fundamentally and the magnitude of the change is only beginning to be visible. Tomorrow, Jiro. Tonight, this. Momo Yaoyorozu, Queen of Creation, had made her choice and found it solid under her feet, and she settled into it with the composed, absolute certainty of someone who knew how to assess a foundation and had found this one sound. Chapter 3, The Sound Before the Storm. Jiro knew something was wrong with herself before she could name it. It started the morning after the raid, when she woke up 40 minutes before her alarm and lay in the dark of her room listening to the building breathe. She could always hear a lot, that was the nature of her quirk, the perpetual sensory landscape of her world was richer and more layered than most people's, but this was different. She was listening for something specific. Tracking it without meaning to, the way you track a song that got stuck in your head before you realized you were humming it. She was listening for Midoriya. She found him on the 3rd floor, his room, no movement, no sound of sleep, just that frequency. That low, resolved chord that her quirk had latched onto in the triage area and hadn't let go of since. It was doing things to her sonar that she didn't have language for yet, like the difference between a note played on a cheap instrument and the same note played on something old and resonant and built for exactly that sound. Her quirk wanted to follow it. Just stay on it. Track it the way you track a good bassline without meaning to. She peeled herself out of bed and picked up her guitar. She played for 4 hours. Same progression, over and over, because her hands needed to be doing something and her mind needed to be doing something else, which was the specific dual-track processing she'd always used when something was bothering her that she didn't want to look at directly. The guitar took the body, and the mind could work the problem from the corner of its eye. The problem was this: she had felt the frequency of Izuku Midoriya in her bones before she'd seen his face last night, and she had known, the way she knew a chord was right before she fully heard it, that whatever had happened to him was real, was permanent, and was going to require her to do something about it. She didn't want to do something about it. She wanted to observe, assess, maintain the specific emotional distance that had served her very well for 20 years of being Jiro Kyoka, who was composed and skeptical and did not get swept up. She played the progression until her fingertips ached. Then she went to class. The day had the strange, slightly surreal quality of days that follow catastrophic events. The raid had been public enough that the student body knew something significant had happened, and the specific shape of the rumors varied from Midoriya destroyed a sublevel to Midoriya died and came back wrong to some version that involved Bakugo, which almost certainly meant Bakugo himself had said something unguarded in frustration and the words had gotten out and mutated. Izuku attended every class. He sat in his usual seat. He took notes, answered questions when called on, ate lunch at the usual table. On the surface, the architecture of his day was completely ordinary. But Jiro sat 2 rows behind him in heroics theory, and she had her jacks out for most of the class because Aizawa was going through the after-action report and it required detailed attention, and from 2 rows back with her jacks extended she could hear everything Izuku was doing. His heartbeat was slow. Not dangerously slow, steady, calm, absolutely rhythmic, the kind of resting heart rate that athletes spent years developing. He breathed once every 12 seconds. He wrote his notes at the same pace he always had, but his hand didn't shake when he pressed hard on the pen the way it sometimes did, and there was none of the subtle background sound of someone containing nervous energy, the small shifts, the micro-adjustments, the barely there sounds of a body that was constantly ready to run. He was still. At rest in a way she'd never heard from him before, because Midoriya had never been fully at rest in his entire life, and the absence of that particular background noise of constant readiness was disorienting. She pulled her jacks in and stared at the board. At lunch, Momo sat beside him. Jiro noticed this from across the cafeteria without meaning to, and she noticed the specific quality of how Momo sat beside him, not the careful, equidistant politeness of their usual social arrangement, but closer, with the natural ease of someone who had arrived at a new proximity and was comfortable in it. She noticed Momo's eyes, too. Something was different there, the same way something was different in Izuku's, not the color, not the structure, but the quality of the attention behind them. Momo had always been sharp. Now the sharpness had a depth behind it, like a knife that had been well made before and had just been properly sharpened for the first time. Jiro ate her lunch and told herself she wasn't analyzing this. She was absolutely analyzing this. Kaminari dropped into the seat beside her with his tray and immediately said, "Okay, so is Midoriya different or am I having a day?" And Jiro said, "You're having a day," on pure reflex, which was unfair and not fully honest, but it closed the conversation and she needed the conversation closed. Afternoon training was worse. Because in afternoon training she couldn't avoid it, they were doing close-range combat practice, rotation-based, which meant at some point in the hour everyone fought everyone, and at some point that meant she was across the mat from Izuku. She'd fought him before. She knew his patterns, the specific tell in his left shoulder before a pivot, the way he committed to a right-hand strike slightly more heavily than he meant to, the small compensatory hitch that all those broken bones had left in his movement vocabulary. She'd catalogued all of it because that was how she processed the world. Sound first, then pattern, then person. She didn't know the patterns of whatever was across the mat from her now. He was calm. Not careful, calm, the way you're calm when the gap between what you're capable of and what the situation requires is wide enough that you don't need to think about it. He moved differently, the same fundamental technique, but cleaner, without the micro-corrective adjustments of a body compensating for past damage. He was operating at maybe 15% of his actual capability. She could hear it in his breathing, completely unaffected, and in the steadiness of his heartbeat through the ambient sound of the training hall. She pushed hard. Harder than she usually would in a training rotation, driving him with her jacks and forcing movement, trying to find the edges of whatever this was. He responded to everything she threw at him with a focus and economy of movement that was almost patient, and that patience was infuriating in a way she couldn't entirely justify. "You're holding back," she said, dropping back to reset her stance. Yes, he said. Don't. He looked at her steadily. Jiro, I said don't. She came at him again, harder, a combination she'd been developing all term, sonar-guided, designed to give her directional information that made her attacks more accurate than random movement should allow. He adjusted to the sonar naturally, he could hear it too, she realized, her own quirk reflected back, and something about that made her push harder. He redirected the last strike instead of blocking it, minimal movement, one hand, a precise geometric redirect that left him standing exactly where he'd been and left her momentum carrying her a half-step past. Not a throw, not a counter. Just a calm, articulate no. She stopped. Turned. Her jaw was tight. I know what you're doing, he said. He hadn't raised his voice. Around them, other pairs continued their rotations, but she was aware, peripherally, that Aizawa was watching. I'm training, she said. You're checking, he said. You want to know what I am now? What the limits are? She didn't say anything because he was right and saying nothing was marginally better than confirming it. You can just ask me, he said. I'm not interested in asking, she said, which was also a lie, and the lie tasted bad enough in her mouth that she dropped her stance and looked at him directly for the first time today. You died, she said, quietly, under the noise of the training hall. You died and something else came back wearing your face. I came back, he said. Not something else. How do you know? Because I remember every second of every day I've been alive, including the 2 seconds where I wasn't. I know what changed and what didn't. He held her gaze. I know that you played guitar for 4 hours last night. I know you were listening for me this morning. Her jaw tightened further. That's invasive. You were using your quirk at 3 in the morning in a building I was also in, he said, without heat. I wasn't prying. I was just audible. A pause. What chord progression? Something almost warm moved through his expression. The one you use when you're processing something you don't want to process. You've used it 3 times since first year that I've heard. Exam week of second year. The day of the Class 1A versus 1B exercise results. He paused. The night after the sports festival, first year, when Todoroki used his left side for the first time. She stared at him. I've always listened, Jiro, he said. I just listen better now. The rotation timer sounded. Pairs reshuffled and she stepped off the mat while he moved to his next partner, and she went to the water station and drank deeply and told her heartbeat to do something normal. He had always listened. He'd always known about the chord progression. She thought about first year, about the way he'd asked her about music with the specific enthusiasm that he brought to everything, the way he'd remembered details she'd mentioned once, the name of the bassist in her favorite band, the particular fretwork technique she'd been working on, the way she described her parents' label, and she thought about how she'd always read that as Midoriya being Midoriya, which was its own complete category, Midoriya being Midoriya meaning boundless. Interest and total recall and a warmth so consistent it became structural. She had not, until right now, considered that some of that attention had been specifically directional. She finished her water and went back to training. She went to find him at 9 p.m. She'd argued herself into it and out of it 3 times over the course of the evening, and in the end she went because the alternative, another night of guitar and willful not thinking, was worse. She was Jiro Kyoka. She did not avoid things out of discomfort. She assessed, she confronted, she resolved, she moved on. That was the rhythm. She'd broken it yesterday and she could feel the disruption like a skipped beat in an otherwise clean track. She knocked on his door. He opened it almost immediately, which meant he'd heard her in the hallway, which she already knew, and the awareness of being heard moving toward his door and him already knowing it was her before she knocked was a level of exposure she was going to have to acclimatize to. He stepped back and she came in without being formally invited because if she waited to be formally invited she would stand in the hallway being awkward about it, and she was not awkward about things as a rule. His room was the same as it always was, notes everywhere, the organized chaos of a mind that worked by externalizing everything. Hero analysis, quirk notes, training schedules. But there was a new notebook on the desk, she noticed. Larger than his usual ones. The first several pages were dense with his handwriting. She nodded at it. Your personal documentation. Yes. He sat on the floor with his back against the bed. She'd always known he sat like that, heard the pattern of it, and it was such a specific detail of him that she found it made the rest of the room more stable. He gestured at the desk chair and she sat in it, and they were a comfortable distance apart, which was the right distance for this conversation. Tell me, she said. He told her. More detail than she'd expected. She'd thought he might hedge, might manage the information, but he gave it to her clean and straight, everything from the sublevel fight through the death through the entity and the negotiation and the waking up. He told her about Momo, which she'd already partially known by then, and he told her what he was going to tell her next, and he said it in the same direct way he'd said everything else. She listened to all of it. So, she said, when he finished. Momo's already bonded. Yes. And you want the same from me? Yes. She leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. There was a small stain up there from second year when Kaminari had exploded a can of something and the aftershock had carried further than intended, and she looked at it and thought about the word yes sitting in the space between them, the specific weight of it. I'm going to be honest with you, she said. Please. The frequency thing. She looked back down at him. The chord that resolved. I've been hearing it since last night and I can't turn it off, and I've been trying. She watched his face. He didn't look satisfied by this. He looked careful, like he understood the difference between information offered as evidence of feeling and information offered as complaint. I know, he said. That's not fair, she said. I didn't choose to hear it. It's just, there. Like a sound my quirk decided was important. She frowned. Is that the influence? The vampiric mental influence? No, he said, and his voice was firm. I haven't directed anything at you. What you're hearing is what I am. The frequency is just me, what I've become. Your quirk responding to it is your quirk responding to it. I can't make that happen, and I wouldn't. How do I know that? You don't, he said simply. You have to decide whether you trust my word on it. She sat with that for a moment. Trust. She had a reasonably well-calibrated trust sensor, built over 20 years of being someone who paid close attention to the sounds people made rather than the words, the gives, the hesitations, the specific vocal qualities of someone saying something they didn't entirely mean. Midoriya had always registered as one of the most honest frequencies she'd ever heard. Even now, shifted and deepened and changed in every measurable way, the honesty of him was the same. Say I believe you, she said. Okay. Say I believe that what I'm hearing is just what you are and you haven't pushed it at me. Okay. That's still a lot, she said. That's still me hearing something I can't turn off and being told it's permanent, it's just going to be there, the sound of you is always going to. She stopped. Say it, he said. She looked at him. His eyes were patient and deep and doing that thing with the light. She had been looking at Izuku Midoriya for 3 years and feeling things she'd been packaging into the general category of complicated, and now the packaging was coming apart and she was sitting here in his desk chair at 9 p.m. unable to make her usually reliable skepticism do its job. The sound of you is the most interesting thing my quirk has ever picked up, she said, flatly, the way she said things she didn't want to be precious about. It's been that way since last night and I'm aware that it's inconvenient and I don't know what to do with it. He didn't react the way she half feared he would, didn't look smug or triumphant or even particularly surprised. He just looked at her, and the quality of that look was the same quality that had been in his voice when he talked about always listening, always knowing the chord progression. You're one of the most perceptive people I've ever known, he said. Everything you hear, you understand. You don't just collect sound, you know it. You hear the truth in things. He paused. I want that. Not as a tool. I want you. The specific Jiro Kyokaness of you that processes the whole world through frequency and pattern and still arrives at something that's more honest than most people reach with all their words. She stared at him. Also, he said, you're going to tell me if I'm missing something. If I'm wrong. If the power starts changing things that shouldn't change. You'll hear it before I notice it. Using me as an early warning system. Using you as a person who matters to me and who will be honest with me when honesty is hard, he said. The early warning system is a bonus. The corner of her mouth moved. Barely. She had a traitor mouth that sometimes found things funny before she decided to find them funny. That's a terrible pitch. I'm not pitching, he said. I'm telling you the truth about what I want and letting you decide what you want. And if I say no, then you say no. She searched his face for the performance in that, the strategic patience, the management, and found none. He meant it. If she said no, he would sit in this room and be what he was, and her quirk would keep hearing the frequency, and they would both continue being the people they were. That, somehow, was the most persuasive thing about any of this. She leaned forward, elbows on knees, and looked at him at his own level. I have conditions, she said. Tell me. Momo told me she made you agree to full transparency and honesty with all three of us. With each other. She did. I'm adding to that. She held up one finger. You never use the influence on me. Not even incidentally if you can help it. I need to know that what I'm feeling and hearing is mine. Agreed. Absolutely. Second finger. I set the pace of this. However this goes, I'm not being moved at a speed I didn't choose. Agreed. Third finger. You teach me everything you learn about what you are. Not just the tactical useful stuff. The weird stuff, the uncertain stuff, all of it. I want the full notes. He almost smiled. I'll get you your own copy of the notebook. She looked at him for a long moment. The room was quiet around them, and she could hear the building's nighttime sounds, Ciro's TV through two walls, the rhythm of Aoyama doing something that involved intermittent light in the hall, the distant percussion of Bakugo apparently working out at this hour because Bakugo had no concept of a rest day. And underneath all of it, clear as a plucked string, the frequency of Izuku Midoriya. She had been hearing it since last night. She was going to hear it for the rest of her life regardless. The question was just whether she was going to be on the outside of what it was or the inside. When she thought about it like that, it wasn't actually much of a decision. Okay, she said. The same word Momo had said, she remembered him telling her, and she understood now the specific inevitability of it, the way the word arrived not like a concession but like a key in a lock. He held her gaze for a moment, checking. She met it evenly. I said okay, Midoriya. Don't make me say it again. He leaned forward, and she stayed still, and his hand covered hers where it rested on her knee, a simple, complete gesture, and then she felt it. It was sound, to her. Where Momo might have felt it as warmth or weight or a door opening, Jiro felt it as sound, a fundamental tone arriving from somewhere deep in her chest and resonating outward, through bone and skin and air, until it was both inside her and surrounding her simultaneously. It was the chord progression. The one she'd been playing for 4 hours. Except resolved, fully resolved, the final note landing with the authority of something that had always been coming and had finally arrived. She held very still and let it move through her. It wasn't overwhelming. That was the thing she'd been braced for, overwhelming, consuming, the loss of some essential Jiro Kyokaness that she'd been protecting. But it arrived and settled and she was still herself. Still the person who'd walked in here skeptical and prickly and honest about it. She was herself, and she was also hearing everything. She blinked. The ambient sound of the building had reorganized itself entirely. It wasn't louder, it was more present. Granular. She could hear the difference between Ciro's TV's audio compression and the original recording quality. She could hear, very faintly, the actual physical vibration of the window glass in her room 2 floors and 1 wing away where she'd left the window slightly open. She could hear, somewhere in the building above and to the east, a very quiet, very precise sound that she identified after 2 seconds as Momo creating something small and putting it down. "She's up," Jiro said. Izuku glanced upward, following the same sound, she realized. "She doesn't sleep much anymore," he said. "Is that a side effect?" "Less need," he said. "For both of you now, probably. The body processes rest more efficiently." She thought about this. More efficient rest meant more hours, which meant more practice time, which, she stopped herself because she was doing the Momo thing, jumping to capability analysis, and she allowed herself a brief internal moment of amusement at that. She looked at her hands. She had always been aware of the physical limits of her quirk, the length of her jacks, the range of her sonar, the depth of penetration into surfaces. She extended one jack now, experimentally, and felt for the edge of the range. It wasn't where it usually was. She pushed further. And further. The signal didn't degrade the way it usually degraded, the resolution didn't soften, it stayed sharp, kept going, and she kept going with it, through the walls, through the next room, through the exterior wall of the dormitory and out into the night air, mapping the campus with a resolution and range she'd never touched before. She found the hawk on the support building roof that Izuku had noticed the night before. She found, further out, near the eastern campus perimeter, something else. She went still. "There's someone on the perimeter," she said. Her voice was level, because that was how she handled things that needed handling, level first, action after. "East side. Near the tree line. One person, standing. Not moving." She pushed the sonar further, reading the specific qualities of the sound signature. "Breathing too slowly to be agitated. Not a guard pattern, a guard would be moving. This is a fixed observation point." Izuku's posture didn't change visibly. But the quality of the air in the room changed, the way the atmosphere changes in the moment before a storm that's still 20 miles out, a drop in pressure that your body knows before your mind does. "How long have they been there?" he asked. "I can't tell. They're already still when I found them." She refined the sonar, pushing detail. "Dressed in something that absorbs sound, the reflection quality is wrong for normal fabric. Deliberate dampening material." A pause. "They're watching the dormitory. Specifically this section. Specifically this floor." "Yes." He stood up. Not urgently, with the unhurried decisiveness of someone who has already determined what they're going to do and is simply doing it. He crossed to the window and looked out, and she watched his eyes shift, the pupils expanding in a way that was subtle and non-human, the new optics engaging for long-distance sight. "I see them," he said. "Who is it?" A pause. "Nobody from any file I've memorized." He was quiet for a moment, looking. "They're good. The positioning is professional, sight lines to the room but no position that a normal patrol would sweep. Someone who knows surveillance doctrine." Jiro stood and came to the window beside him, her jack still extended, the sonar painting a picture in her mind. The figure at the tree line was motionless as architecture, and there was a quality to that stillness that matched what she'd heard in Izuku last night in the triage area, the particular stillness of something that doesn't need to move to be dangerous. "That's not a hero," she said. "No," he agreed. "Pale court." He looked at her. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Momo found the references and showed me this afternoon. I spent 3 hours on it." "What?" "I'm fast." He held her gaze for a moment with something that was both appreciation and the beginnings of a different kind of attention. "Yes. Almost certainly. So they're already here." "An observer," he said. "Not an attacker." "Not yet." He looked back at the figure in the tree line, and the quality of his attention was different from anything she'd seen from him before, not calculating, exactly, and not threatening, more like the specific quality of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. They're checking what I am. Reporting back. Should we call it in? No. He said it simply, without hesitation. Not yet. This goes through me. She glanced at him. The old Midoriya would have been halfway down the stairs already, buzzing with the need to act, to involve everyone, to assemble the response. This version looked at the figure in the tree line and had clearly already decided on his response, and the response was to stand here and be seen. You're letting them look, she said. I'm telling them what they're dealing with, he said. Not with words. She thought about this. She thought about sound, about how sometimes the most powerful thing you could do in a room was play one clean note and let it sit there, let the air carry it, let everyone feel the resonance of it without being told what it meant. Sometimes the music did the work. Sometimes you just had to be fully what you were and let the frequency reach. She extended her sonar again, not probing this time, just, present. Letting her new range speak. Letting whoever was in the tree line feel, through whatever senses they had, that the dormitory window had two people in it and both of them could see just fine in the dark. After a moment, the figure in the tree line moved. Not running, walking. The specific unhurried walk of someone who has seen what they came to see and is leaving on their own terms, preserving the appearance of control over a situation where control had already been quietly taken from them. They moved through the tree line and the sonar lost them past the perimeter wall. Jiro retracted her jack. They'll report back, she said. Yes. Izuku turned from the window. And whoever they report to will make a decision. How long do we have? He thought about it. Enough time to be ready. Vague. Genuinely uncertain, he corrected. I'll work on better intelligence. She nodded once, filing it. Then she looked at him with the direct, no ceremony quality that was her natural register. I need to know something. Ask. When they come, and they will, you know they will, are you going to send us somewhere safe while you handle it? She watched his face carefully. Because I want to be very clear that if that's the plan is wrong. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. That is not the plan. Good answer. You're not accessories, he said, and his voice had the quality of something fundamental being stated, not reassured. You're not people I'm protecting by keeping them at a distance. You're mine. The Pale Court will understand what that means before I'm done. She held that. The word mine, which should have bristled, she was Jiro Kyoka, she bristled at ownership in any form on principle, didn't bristle. It arrived with the clean, resonant weight of a word being used precisely, in the exact context where it meant the exact thing it was supposed to mean. All right, she said. She moved toward the door, because it was late and there were things to think about and she thought best in her own space with her guitar within reach. Jiro. She stopped. Turned slightly. Thank you, he said. For coming here. For being honest. She looked at him. The room was dim, just the desk lamp, and the light caught in his eyes the way it had been doing since last night, green and deep and older than the face it belonged to. The chord hummed in her chest, warm and steady, the most honest thing she'd ever heard. You knew I was going to come, she said. Not an accusation, just checking. Momo said you would, he said. She shook her head, the traitor mouth almost smiling again. She's insufferable when she's right. She's right a lot. I know. It's a whole thing. She pushed the door open. Get some sleep. I know you don't need it. Do it anyway. You need to practice seeming normal for a little longer. She paused in the doorway. There are people who are going to notice before we're ready for them to notice, and Aizawa is definitely already halfway to noticing, and you sitting in your room in the dark listening to the city all night is not helping your cover. A beat. Then, that's good advice. I'm full of good advice. Good night, Midoriya. She walked down the hall to the stairwell, and she took the stairs to her floor, and she went into her room and picked up her guitar out of pure reflex, muscle memory, the comfort of it. She played the chord progression once. Let the final note land. Felt it resolve in her chest in the exact same moment, the external sound and the internal resonance completing each other with a synchronicity that would have unsettled her yesterday and today just felt like information. She put the guitar down and lay back on her bed and looked at the ceiling. She was Jiro Kyoka. She did not get swept up. She assessed, she confronted, she resolved. She had assessed. She had confronted. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum, where the bond sat warm and steady, and felt the low resolved frequency of it, and admitted to herself, quietly, in the dark, with nobody to hear it, that this particular resolution felt nothing like getting swept up. It felt like coming into tune. Across the campus, at the eastern perimeter wall, the figure from the tree line was gone. Moving through Muzutafu's night streets with the fluid invisibility of someone very old and very practiced, heading for a place that didn't appear on any map, carrying information that would reach very old ears before morning. Kalen had seen enough. He walked through the city with his hands in his coat pockets and his expression giving nothing away, and in the back of his ancient, careful mind he was revising every assumption he'd arrived in Japan with. The Overlord seat had been empty for 2,000 years. In that time the Pale Court had operated with the quiet, permanent authority of something with no natural predator, and they had, he could admit this to himself, at least, grown comfortable in that authority. Comfortable in a way that made them slow. Made them certain. The boy in the dormitory window had looked at him across 400 meters of dark campus and seen him. Not found him with technology or a quirk search or a sweep. Just, looked at the right place, at the right moment, with eyes that caught the dark the way a cat's eyes caught light, and held his gaze from 400 meters with the absolute composure of someone who was not surprised to be observed and was not concerned about it. And beside him, the dark-haired girl with the jacks had extended her senses past anything Kalen had encountered in a bonded human and mapped the tree line clean. 2 of them already. 2 days after the transformation. He didn't run. He didn't hurry. But he walked faster, and he thought harder, and by the time he reached the building that wasn't on any map he had already drafted the opening of the report he was going to send to the Pale Court, and the opening said, reassess all prior assumptions. This is not what we expected. Chapter 4, The Wicked Game. Midnight called him into her office on a Thursday. Not a request, a summons, the kind that came through official UA channels with the specific formal language that meant this was happening on the record. Student Midoriya Izuku, please report to Instructor Kayama's office, 4 p.m., regarding post-incident assessment and ongoing welfare monitoring. Jiro had seen it on the shared student notice board and looked at Jiro and said nothing, but the look said plenty. Jiro had read the look and said, good luck, with the specific tone that meant she wasn't sure luck was the relevant resource here. He arrived at 4 p.m. exactly. Midnight's office was on the second floor of the faculty building, a corner room that got the late afternoon light and had been decorated with the specific energy of someone who refused to make their professional space feel impersonal. There were framed prints on the walls, abstract, bold, nothing you could easily categorize. A plant in the corner that was genuinely thriving. A desk that was organized in a way that looked casual but wasn't, the specific surface arrangement of someone who knew where everything was and had opinions about where it should be. She was standing at the window when he came in, which he suspected was deliberate. It put her in the light and him in the relative dimness of the doorway, a standard power positioning move, control of visual hierarchy. She was in her teaching clothes rather than her hero costume, which meant this was being framed as an educational conversation. Her back was partially to him and she turned at the sound of the door, which gave him a moment to read her before she could read him. She looked, he thought, like someone who had been preparing for this conversation all day and had prepared well and was still slightly less certain than she wanted to be. Midoriya, she said. Close the door. He closed it. Came fully into the room and stood in front of her desk rather than sitting, because sitting would put him lower and he wasn't interested in lower. She registered this immediately, he saw it in the slight adjustment of her expression, the recalibration. She moved from the window to behind her desk, which put the desk between them, and she sat, which was interesting because it now made her lower, and he suspected she realized this about 2 seconds after doing it. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine standing," he said pleasantly. A beat. Something moved in her eyes that was quick and controlled and might, in different light, have been amusement. "Of course you are." She set a tablet on the desk in front of her. "This is a formal welfare check, as I imagine you know. After an incident of the severity of the factory raid, UA protocol requires that any student involved in significant physical trauma undergo a structured follow-up assessment." "I understand," he said. "Your medical report," she said, turning the tablet so he could see the document, uses the phrase inconsistent with prior injury pattern 11 times in 4 pages, which I think is a record for the medical team. "Dr. Amada told me personally that your blood work has been sent to 3 separate labs for verification because the first 2 results were considered instrument error." "That sounds like a documentation challenge," he said. "It sounds like a student who died in a sublevel and walked out without a scratch, and nobody wants to write that in the official report," she said, and there was something underneath the professional tone now, something direct that the professional framing had been sitting on top of. He looked at her steadily. "What would you like me to tell you?" "I'd like you to tell me the truth." She held his gaze. "Not the version for the medical team or the version for Aizawa's operational debrief. The actual truth." A pause, and then she added, with a very slight shift in her voice that might have been vulnerability in a different register, "I was in that doorway. I saw what came out of that sublevel. I've been doing this job for a long time and I know the difference between a student who had a close call and something else." He considered her for a moment. She held the consideration without flinching. She was good at being looked at, had built a career partly on that skill, but this was a different kind of looking and they both knew it, and the fact that she held it without performing her way through it told him something real. He pulled out the chair in front of her desk and sat down. She blinked. He'd been standing specifically, and now he was choosing to sit, and the shift of it, from refused courtesy to deliberate decision, reframed the whole geometry of the room. He put his arms on the desk, easy and forward, and looked at her at eye level from across 3 feet of workspace. "I died in the sublevel," he said. "Completely. My heart stopped and I was clinically gone, and then something found me in the dark and made an offer and I took it." He said it the way he'd told Momo and Jiro, clean, straight, no hedging. "I'm a vampire. The specific term is Overlord, which means something to certain very old organizations that you haven't heard of yet but will hear of soon. I have the strength and the speed and the sensory capability you'd probably expect and several other things that I'm still cataloging. I'm not a danger to the students and I'm not going to become one. Everything that makes me me is still present. I'm just, more." Silence. Midnight looked at him across the desk. Her expression was doing something careful and controlled that was containing, he suspected, a significantly less controlled response. She breathed in once, slowly. Breathed out. "Vampire," she said. "Yes." As in yes, that. Genuinely. Another silence. Then she said, "The sun." "Fine. I tested it the morning after. Blood." He paused. "Working on alternatives. Not a pressing issue yet. Immortal. Appears so. At 17. 18 next month, actually." The corner of her mouth moved despite herself. She pressed it flat immediately. "This isn't funny." "I know." She stood up. Went to the window again, and this time he suspected it wasn't positioning, it was genuine, the need to have something to look at that wasn't him while she processed. She stood with her arms crossed, looking at the UA grounds, and he waited, because waiting was something he was very good at now. "Aizawa knows," she said. It wasn't a question. "He knows something fundamental changed. I told him I'd explain when I understood it better." "And do you understand it better?" "More than I did." "Not completely." She was quiet for a moment, then, "The girls." She said it carefully, like she was placing something fragile on a surface. Yaoyorozu and Jiro. Something changed with them too. He watched the line of her back. She was very still, and the stillness was the kind that meant the mind behind it was moving very fast. Yes, he said. How? I bonded them. Their choice, freely made, completely informed. He kept his voice level. It enhanced their existing capabilities. Changed nothing about who they are. She turned from the window. The professional framing was gone now, he noticed. She was just looking at him, Namuri Kayama looking at Izuku Midoriya, the performance of the teacher's role set aside because the situation had outgrown it. You bonded two of my students. They bonded themselves. I asked. They decided. He held her gaze. I was very clear about what I was asking. I was very clear about what it meant. And I was very clear that no was a complete answer that changed nothing between us. She stopped. Started again. You're 17. 18 next month, he said again, quietly. The difference between 17 and 18 doesn't cover what you're describing, she said, and there was something sharp in it now, the thing she'd been managing coming through. You're my student. I have a responsibility to, I know what your responsibility is, he said. Not cutting her off, acknowledging, and then moving past. And I know that right now you're in a room with someone who was your student yesterday and is something significantly different today, and the categories you're used to using aren't fitting cleanly, and that's genuinely complicated. He paused. I'm not asking you to cross a professional line, Kayama-san. I'm asking you to look at what's actually in front of you instead of what the role says should be. The use of her name, not her title, Kayama-san, not Midnight, not Sensei, landed in the room with a specific weight. She heard it. He saw her hear it. And what, she said, very carefully, is actually in front of me? He stood up. Not aggressively, just, again, a deliberate choice about how to occupy the space. He was taller than she usually registered him as being, and his eyes in the afternoon light coming through the window were doing the thing with the color that she'd noticed in the doorway 3 nights ago and had been not thinking about since. Something that finds you extraordinary, he said. Has for a while. Something that has enough time now and enough certainty to say so without hedging. He didn't move toward her, kept the desk between them, kept the distance exactly what it was. Not a student with a crush. Not something impulsive. Something that knows what it is and knows what it wants and is telling you clearly so you can make a clear decision. She stared at him. You're using the influence, she said. You said you have, I'm not, he said, and his voice was absolutely flat with honesty. Check. You're one of the most sensory-aware people I've met, you've spent your career learning to read situations and people. Check the room. Check what you're feeling. Is it being pushed at you from outside or is it already yours? She checked. He watched her check, watched the sharp, professional mind turn inward and run its assessment with the same rigor she'd bring to any other analysis. She was quiet for about 10 seconds. I hate that you told me to do that, she said. I know. Because now I've confirmed that what I'm feeling is mine, which was not the answer I was hoping for. I know. Which means I don't get to be angry about the influence. You can be angry about other things, he said. There are legitimate complications here. I'm not pretending there aren't. She looked at him with an expression that was several things at once, exasperation and recognition and the particular discomfort of someone whose very well-constructed armor has been bypassed without being broken through, just, walked around. How long, she said. Have I found you extraordinary? Since the first week of first year. You walked into heroics in that classroom and you were, he paused, and when he resumed his voice had a quality that was specifically his, that unguarded honesty that had survived everything, you were performing. You knew it and you didn't know you knew it. But there was something underneath it that was completely real, and I kept watching for it. You showed it sometimes, when you forgot to be Midnight for a minute and were just, he gestured slightly. Just yourself. She was very still. That's the person I'm talking to right now, he said. Not the pro hero. Not the teacher. Just you. Namiri Kayama, who had spent 23 years becoming professionally impervious to being seen through, found herself standing in her own office with no particularly good response to this. You're 18 next month, she said, finally. Yes. I'm 28. Yes. I'm your teacher. For the next 7 months, he said. Then you're not. She looked at him for a long, measured moment. The afternoon light was going golden and the office was warm and there was something in the air between them that had been there since the doorway 3 nights ago and had been growing quietly, patiently, all week. I'm not making any decisions today, she said. I'm not asking for decisions today, he said. I'm asking you to know what I've told you and think about it honestly. That's all. She held his gaze. And when I've thought about it. Then we talk again. The simplicity of it, no pressure, no timeline, no strategic positioning, was more effective than anything complicated would have been, and she suspected he knew it, and she further suspected that wasn't manipulation so much as just the truth of what he wanted, which was exactly what he'd said. She exhaled. Sat back down. Picked up the tablet. For the official record, she said, and her voice had settled back into the professional register though something had changed in the quality of it, looser, slightly less performed, your welfare assessment is ongoing and I'm recommending bi-weekly check-ins. Of course, he said. And the information about your, she chose the word carefully, condition is being managed in a small circle for now. Agreed. Aizawa will need the full picture soon. I'll give it to him this week. She nodded. Made a note. Then, without looking up from the tablet, the thing you called the pale court. He went still. Not visibly, just a quality in the air. You looked it up. You walked out of a sublevel 2 days ago as an immortal vampire overlord and there was a surveillance operative on the campus perimeter the same night. I looked everything up. She looked up from the tablet now, and her eyes were sharp and direct and completely herself, the real Namiri, the one that had survived decades of a dangerous career by being smarter than the situations she walked into. They're going to move against you. Yes. How soon? I don't know exactly. We saw their observer the night of the bonding. They're assessing. She said. Jiro detected them. She has extended sonar range now. Better than anything, he paused, and something moved in his expression that was both pride and warmth in equal measure, better than anything I've measured. She studied him. He was talking about Jiro with the same specific quality he'd used when talking about Momo, not possession, not strategic advantage, something more organic than either. She filed this carefully next to the thing about his eyes and the thing about her own feelings that she just confirmed were hers. I want to be involved, she said. He looked at her. When they make their move, she said. I'm a pro hero. I've been doing this for 10 years. I have capabilities and contacts and operational experience that your students don't have yet. She met his eyes. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you that I'm going to be involved whether you loop me in or not, and it would be strategically better for everyone if you looped me in. The specific angle of what she'd just done was elegant. She'd removed his choice about whether to involve her and given him only the choice of how, which was not something he'd expected, and she could see that he hadn't expected it, which was satisfying in the way that good tactical moves were satisfying. He looked at her for a moment with those deep, ancient green eyes. All right, he said. A pause. I'm glad you're in this. Don't be glad yet, she said. I'm still deciding how irritating I find all of this. He almost smiled. How irritating do you currently find it? Considerably, she said. But declining. He did smile then, and it was such a clean, unguarded smile that she had to look back at her tablet because the alternative was smiling back and she wasn't ready to do that where he could see it. 4 p.m. next Thursday, she said. Second check-in. I'll be here, he said. She heard him leave. Heard the door close. Sat in her office in the golden late light and looked at the plant in the corner that was genuinely thriving. Get it together, she told herself. It worked less well than it had 3 nights ago on the steps outside the triage facility. The message came that evening. Not a surveillance operative this time, not the patient, watching stillness of an observer maintaining distance. This arrived at 7 p.m. as a physical object, a letter, black envelope, no stamp, slid under the door of Izuku's room sometime between when he'd left for dinner and when he'd returned. The paper inside was heavy, cream-colored, and the writing on it was done with a pen in an ink that was a shade too dark to be exactly black. The handwriting was small and precise and had the particular quality of someone who had been writing by hand for so long that the style had compressed into pure efficiency. Midoriya Izuku. The Pale Court acknowledges the activation of the Overlord seat. Per ancient compact, the court requests a formal presentation, the Overlord before the assembled court, to establish legitimacy and accept oversight. Refusal of presentation within 14 days will be interpreted as a declaration of conflict. The court looks forward to your compliance. There was no signature. There was a seal at the bottom, a crest, pressed in the too dark ink, a circle of stylized figures that his new eyes could resolve easily, 7 seated figures arranged around a central empty throne. He read it twice. Folded it. Put it in his pocket. Then he sent a message to Momo and Jiro, my room, 20 minutes. They were there in 15. Momo read the letter first, standing, processing at speed. He watched her eyes track the text twice and then go to the ceiling for 3 seconds while she worked. Jiro read over Momo's shoulder and her jaw did the tight thing it did when she was sorting anger from assessment. 14 days, Momo said. Yes. The word compliance, Jiro said, flatly. I noticed that too. It's not a request, Momo said. It's framed as a request but the structure is ultimatum. She set the letter on the desk with the careful precise movement she used when handling things she found distasteful. They're testing whether you'll come obediently. And if I do, Jiro said, I'm already operating under their framework. I'm already treating them as the authority in this. Yes, Izuku said. They looked at him. He was sitting on the floor with the notebook open on his knee, his handwriting moving across a page without him looking at it, the note-taking happening on autopilot while he thought, the oldest habit, not gone but changed, the notes faster and more organized than they'd ever been. So what's the response, Momo said. He closed the notebook. I'm going to send a reply. What does it say, Jiro said. He thought about the letter's language. The requests and the compliance and the 14 days that were meant to feel like mercy but were structured like a countdown. He thought about the 7 seated figures around an empty throne. He thought about 2,000 years of an organization growing comfortable with no natural predator. It says that I'm aware of the ancient compact and I respect the history of the court, he said. And that I'll appear before them. He paused. At a time and location of my choosing. Silence. Then Jiro said, very quietly, oh that's good. It accepts the compact without accepting the terms, Momo said, and something moved through her expression, the specific quality she got when she encountered a tactical move that satisfied her, precise and economical and completely effective. You're not refusing. You're reframing. I'm not their subject presenting for approval, he said. I'm the Overlord acknowledging an existing structure. The distinction matters. They won't like it, Momo said. No, he agreed. But they'll respond to it. Because the alternative is acknowledging that they wrote to me as a subject and I replied as a superior, which means either they accept the dynamic or they escalate, and escalating immediately tells me everything I need to know about who they are and how to handle them. Jiro was looking at him with that specific expression she got when she was hearing something that resonated. You've been thinking about this since before the letter arrived. Since the observer at the perimeter, he said. The letter was just the next move in a sequence. Momo said, we need midnight in this room. Izuku and Jiro both looked at her. She found the court references independently and she told you she's involved regardless of whether you loop her in, Momo said, with the particular precision of someone who had already made a decision and was explaining the reasoning for completeness. She has 10 years of operational experience and professional contacts that we don't have access to as students. She's also, a slight pause, a subtle adjustment in her tone, she's already in this, in other ways. Jiro tilted her head. Other ways. Momo looked at Jiro with the expression that said she'd observed something and had been waiting for the right moment to say it. You've been hearing the frequency since the sublevel. I felt the pull of the bond before Midoriya said a word to me. Midnight has been standing in the blast radius of whatever this is since the moment he walked out of that factory, and she knows it, and she's working very hard not to let it change anything. She looked at Izuku. It's going to change things whether she works hard or not. He was quiet for a moment. She said she needs time to think, he said. She's had 3 days, Momo said, not unkindly. She's Kayama Nimuri. She processes fast. She's done thinking. She held his gaze. She's just waiting for something that makes the decision feel like hers. He looked at Momo for a long moment. What does that look like? Give her the letter, Momo said simply. Let her be useful. She needs to be brought in as a peer, not managed. Give her a problem she can solve and stand back. Jiro made a small sound that was the compressed version of well that's just exactly right, and turned to look at something on the wall with her mouth doing the almost smile thing. He thought about Midnight in her office with the sharp eyes and the plant that was thriving and the performance she maintained and the real thing underneath it. He thought about her saying I'm not asking for your permission and the elegant tactical move it was, and how she'd said it with the ease of someone who didn't need to be aggressive because they were simply confident in their own capability. He picked up the black envelope from the desk. I'll go now, he said. Not too late, Momo said. It's 7:30, he said. She goes to bed late, Jiro said, without looking away from the wall. I've checked. She's a night person. You're fine. He looked between them. You're both terrifying, he said. Thank you, they said, almost simultaneously, and the precise synchronicity of it made all three of them briefly lose their composure, the kind of shared laughter that happens when something hits at exactly the right angle, and for a moment the room was full of that specific warmth that doesn't have a formal name but that people spend their whole lives trying to find and most of them never do. He left them to it and went to find Midnight. Her apartment was on the faculty residential side of the campus. She hadn't given him the number but he didn't need it. He followed the specific frequency of her and found the right door and knocked. She answered in non-work clothes, jeans, a loose dark shirt, hair down, which was a version of her he hadn't seen before and which was quite obviously her, the unconstructed version, the Nimuri rather than the Midnight. She read his face before he said anything, and then read the envelope, and stepped back from the door. He came in. Her apartment was the office but more so, more of herself in it, the bold prints extended to a whole wall of them, books stacked with the organized chaos of someone who read widely and simultaneously. She had music playing quietly, and when she turned to face him he held out the envelope. She took it. Read it. Read it again. Time and location of your choosing, she said, reading the draft reply he'd scrawled on the back of the envelope in the hall. Yes. She looked up. That's going to infuriate them. Yes. Something sharpened in her eyes, the specific quality of a mind that had been idling at a problem and was now being given the problem in full. You need someone who knows how old organizations operate. Governance structures, power hierarchies, the specific ways that institutions like this enforce compliance and the specific pressure points that make them back down. I need exactly that, he said. She looked at him. He watched her assess, not him, the situation, herself in the situation, the specifics of what was being asked and what it meant. He stayed where he was and let her look. This is real, she said. Not a question. Working aloud. Completely. The Pale Court. Ancient vampiric governance. An overlord who's been absent for 2,000 years and has now come back as a UA third year. She said it with the flat, dry quality of someone narrating absurdity while simultaneously taking it completely seriously. That's accurate, he said. And you need me for this because you're the best operational mind I have access to, he said. Because you've been working in this field for 10 years and you understand the architecture of power in ways I'm still learning. A pause. And because you already decided you were going to be involved regardless, which means you've already assessed that this is real and significant and worth your time. She looked at him for a long moment. The music played quietly behind her, something with low strings and a steady pulse, and the apartment was warm and she was standing in it without the armor of her professional framing and there was nothing between them but the honesty of what they'd said to each other 3 hours ago in her office. What do you need from me right now, she said. Sit down with me and help me draft the response, he said. And then tell me what you know about how old institutions respond when their authority is challenged by something they don't have a category for. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she sat down. She pulled a pad from the coffee table and picked up a pen, and he sat across from her, and they began. She was extraordinary at this. He'd known it abstractly, had seen flashes of it in class, but with the full context open between them and the actual problem on the table she was something else entirely, the professional competence fully engaged and alive, asking incisive questions and building the picture from his answers with an efficiency that meant she'd arrived at the shape of the pale court in 20 minutes from 17 sentences. They worked for 2 hours. She drafted. He refined. She pushed back 3 times on phrasing and was right every time, and he told her so directly, and she received it with the ease of someone who knew they were right and didn't need to perform certainty about it. At 9:30 she made coffee without asking if he wanted some and handed him a cup, and he took it, and she said, "You know you don't actually need caffeine anymore." "I know," he said. "It still tastes good." She sat back down. Looked at the final draft on the pad. It was clean and exact and said precisely what he'd described, acknowledgement without submission, a counteroffer that reframed the dynamic without explicitly rejecting the compact. It was better than anything he'd have written alone. "This is good," he said. "It's excellent," she said, without modesty. "They're going to hate it and respond to it because they can't not respond to it." Momo said something similar. "Yaoyorozu has good instincts." She paused. "She sent you here." He didn't deny it. She and Jiro both. She looked at the pad. Something moved in her expression, and when she looked up it was with that quality he'd seen in the office, the real thing, not the performance, just herself. "They know," she said. "They know. They're supportive." A beat. Momo specifically said to give you a problem to solve and stand back. She held his gaze for a long moment. "That's irritatingly accurate," she said. "She's irritatingly accurate about most things. I'm aware." She looked at the pad again, set it down with finality. "I'll tell you what I've decided." "All right. I'm in. Fully, professionally, as operational support on the Pale Court situation." Her voice was clear and exact. "Whatever else this is or becomes, that decision stands on its own and it stands now." "Understood." "The other thing." She met his eyes. "I'm not there yet. I want to be clear about that." "I know. But she paused, choosing the word with precision, "closer than I was 3 days ago." He looked at her. "That's honest." "I'm always honest," she said. "I just don't always say the honest thing out loud." "There's a difference." "There is," he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment in the warm apartment with the quiet music, and he looked back, and between them was the draft of a letter that would reach the Pale Court in the morning and the beginning of something that didn't have a category yet but was building its own architecture steadily, the way all real things build, not in one gesture but in accumulated honest moments, each one a brick. "Same time next Thursday," she said. "We need to wargame their possible responses." "I'll be there," he said. He stood. moved toward the door. She stayed on the sofa with the pad in her lap and the coffee cup in her hand. Midoriya, she said, when he had his hand on the door. He looked back. For the record, she said, and her voice was quiet and entirely her own, I noticed you in the first week of first year too. He held her gaze. Good night, Kayama-san, he said. The corner of her mouth moved. Good night. He let himself out into the corridor and walked back across the campus in the dark, and behind him the apartment light stayed on for a long time. Chapter 5, The Pale Court's Gambit. The response came in 6 days. Not 14, 6, which told Izuku everything he needed to know about how well the reply had landed. The Pale Court had read his counteroffer, had sat with it for less than half their own allotted window, and had moved. The second envelope was the same heavy black, the same too dark ink, but the handwriting was different this time, larger, more deliberate, the writing of someone who wanted the weight of each word felt. The court accepts the Overlord's counterproposal. Neutral ground, Overlord's designation. 7 days hence. The court will send one representative to establish preliminary terms. His name is Kalen. He will arrive alone. Midnight read it over his shoulder at the Thursday check-in, which had organically become a working session rather than a welfare assessment, and said, they blinked. Partially, Momo said from the corner of the office where she'd set up with her tablet, because Momo had started attending the Thursday sessions 2 weeks ago and nobody had formally discussed this, it had simply happened the way things happen when a person's presence in a situation is clearly correct. They accepted neutral ground but they're controlling the representative. Kalen is their choice, not a mutual selection. Kalen was the observer at the perimeter, Jiro said. She was sitting on the windowsill, which was her preferred surface in any room with a windowsill, jacks out, monitoring the ambient frequencies of the faculty building and the grounds beyond it with the absent focus of someone knitting. I've been building his sound profile since that night. I know what he sounds like from 400 meters. Midnight looked at Jiro on the windowsill and then at Momo in the corner and then at Izuku, and her expression had the quality it sometimes got in these sessions, something that was not quite adjustment but lived next door to it, the professional recalibration of someone integrating new information about a situation she'd thought she had fully mapped. You said he was good, she said to Izuku. Exceptional, he said. The positioning that night was professional grade. He knew what he was doing. He's ancient, Momo said, not looking up from her tablet. I've cross-referenced the name across 12 sources now. Kalen appears in Pale Court references going back 8 centuries, always in an enforcement capacity. He's not a figurehead. He's the person they send when they want something done precisely. So they're taking this seriously, Midnight said. They're taking it seriously enough to send their best, Izuku said. Which means they're not sure what they're dealing with yet. 7 days to prepare, Midnight said. Location? I have somewhere in mind, he said. The location was an abandoned concert hall on the eastern edge of Muzudafu, one of those buildings that sat in the gap between the city's active life and its history, closed for renovation funding that never came, structurally sound but dark, the kind of place that appeared in city records and nowhere else. Midnight had found it through her pro-hero contacts in 2 hours flat and had sent him the address with a message that said simply, this. Trust me. He'd looked up the specs and agreed immediately. It had acoustics that would mean Jiro heard everything in the building from any position in it. It had multiple structural levels with clear sight lines, which meant Momo's creation range covered every angle. It had exactly 2 entry points that mattered, which were manageable. And it was off every grid that a standard hero patrol used, which meant no interference from outside parties who didn't know enough to be useful. Midnight had called in a quiet favor with a city liaison and gotten them access without documentation. She's good at this, Jiro said, when she and Izuku were doing the walk through the day before Kalen's arrival. She's exceptional at this, he said. Jiro glanced at him. She had her jacks extended, mapping the hall's acoustic geometry with the focused attention she brought to spaces she was learning. It's been 2 weeks since the office meeting. Yes. She's in every Thursday session now. Yes. And she stays after, Jiro said. I can hear the conversation through the floor. It goes until about 11 on average. She paused. I'm not complaining. I'm observing. He looked at her. She was running her sonar along the upper gallery with the focused expression of someone only partially having this conversation, the other half of her attention on the building's geometry. What are you actually saying? He said. I'm saying she's making her decision and you should probably give her a little more. She stopped, tilted her head, refined the sonar. Hold on. Her voice shifted completely, all personal conversation evacuated, replaced by the specific precision she used when the information was tactical. There's someone in the building. He was still immediately. Upper gallery, she said. East side. They came in through the roof access. I can hear the fresh draft from the hatch. They've been here, she calculated from the ambient temperature differential, 20 minutes at least. Before we arrived. He looked up. His eyes adjusted, the spatial architecture of the upper gallery resolved in the dark, and there, in the far corner where the shadows were deepest and the angle from the floor was worst, was a shape. A person. Seated. Completely still. One person, Jiro said. Breathing patterns the same as the perimeter. It's him. Izuku looked at the shape in the corner of the upper gallery and said, loud enough to carry easily through the concert hall's acoustics, you're a day early. A pause. Force of habit, said a voice from the upper gallery. It was a good voice, measured, precise, the particular vocal quality of someone who'd had centuries to learn how to use language with exact effect. I prefer to assess spaces before I occupy them formally. So do I, Izuku said. That's why I'm here. Another pause. Then the shape in the corner uncurled and stood, and the figure that stepped to the gallery railing was tall and lean, dressed in dark clothing that absorbed light in the way Jiro had described, deliberately unreflective material, custom, expensive. His face was angular and pale in a way that wasn't dramatic, just factual, and he looked down at Izuku with eyes that caught the ambient light from the hall's skylights in a cold silver that was distinctly non-human. He was, Izuku thought, genuinely old. Not performed old, not affecting antiquity, actually old, the specific quality of someone who had existed long enough that patience had become structural rather than practiced. He stood at the gallery railing with the ease of someone who'd occupied 1,000 such positions in 1,000 such buildings and found this one unremarkable. He looked at Izuku for a long moment. Then he said, "You're younger than I expected." "You're older than I expected," Izuku said. "Though I should have recalibrated from the perimeter observation. That positioning was 8th century military doctrine." Kalen was very still for a moment. "You know it." "I've been studying," Izuku said. "Sit down. We can do the formal meeting tonight instead of tomorrow, since you're already here." Kalen came down from the gallery. He moved the way Izuku had learned to move, with the economy of something that had no wasted function, but older, more compressed, every movement the product of 8 centuries of refining what mattered and discarding what didn't. He crossed the concert hall floor and stopped 12 feet from Izuku, which was a deliberate distance, the formal spacing of a first court meeting per the protocols Momo had found in her research. He looked at Jiro next. She met the look with the flat, direct quality she brought to things she'd already decided about. "The bonded," he said, with a neutrality that was technically not dismissive but held the potential for it. "Jiro Kyoka," she said. "Just that." "I know your name," he said. "Then use it," she said. Something moved through Kalen's expression that was too quick to be entirely read. He looked back at Izuku. "You understand why the court sent me specifically." "You're the enforcer," Izuku said. "You assess threats and determine responses. You were at the perimeter to establish whether I was what the activation suggested or an anomaly that would resolve itself." He paused. "You've concluded I'm not an anomaly." "I've concluded," Kalen said, "that you are exactly what the activation suggested, which presents its own significant set of complications. He looked around the concert hall with those silver eyes. The court hasn't had an overlord in 2,000 years. In that time we've built a governance structure, a set of protocols, a balance of power, Izuku said. A slight pause. Stability, Kalen said. The distinction matters. Does it? Izuku looked at him. The court has been operating without oversight for 2,000 years. Whatever you've built in that time, you've built it without accountability to anything above your own authority. That's power. Calling it stability doesn't change the structure of it. Kalen looked at him with those ancient silver eyes. You're very confident for someone who has been what he is for 2 weeks. Yes, Izuku said simply. Another pause. Kalen's expression shifted slightly, not challenged exactly, but recalibrating, the way he'd been recalibrating since the perimeter, since the letter, since every exchange had landed differently than he'd modeled. He was, Izuku thought, genuinely intelligent and genuinely capable and genuinely committed to what he believed, which was that the Pale Court structure was the only thing standing between the hidden world and chaos. He also genuinely believed an untrained overlord was a catastrophe waiting to happen. That belief wasn't wrong, exactly. It was just predicated on an assessment of Izuku that was 2 weeks out of date and hadn't been updated for the specific person sitting across from him. Tell me what you actually want, Izuku said. Not the court's position. You. What does Kalen want from this meeting? The question landed differently than Kalen expected. Izuku saw it, the slight catch, the moment where the prepared approach met something the preparation hadn't accounted for. The court's position is my position, he said. That's a rehearsed answer. It's an accurate one. It's both, Izuku said. But it's not the whole answer. You've been in this role for 8 centuries. You've enforced the court's will for 8 centuries. You've done that because you believed in what the court was protecting. Not the court itself, what it was protecting. He held Kalen's gaze. I want to know if you still believe the court is doing that. The concert hall was very quiet. Jiro was completely still on his left, listening with her full attention, and Izuku knew she was hearing every micro-variation in Kalen's voice, every small sound that spoke below the words. Kalen was quiet for a long time. The court has drifted, he said finally, and the words were chosen carefully, each one placed. Over 2,000 years of no overlord, certain priorities have shifted. The protection of the hidden world, which was the original mandate, has become secondary, in some quarters, to the maintenance of the court's own authority. A pause. I have not always agreed with those quarters. But you serve them, Izuku said. I serve the compact, Kalen said. The court exists within the compact. As long as the compact holds, I serve what it is. And if someone proposed changes to the compact, Izuku said. Legitimate changes, through the overlord's authority, which the compact explicitly grants. Kalen looked at him. That depends entirely on the changes. It does, Izuku agreed. Which is why we're having this conversation and not a different one. Something shifted in the architecture of the exchange. Jiro heard it, Izuku could tell by the slight ease in her posture, the way her sonar retracted fractionally, the signal she used for I've read the room and it's not going to be a fight. Not yet, at least. Kalen looked around the concert hall again, and this time the look was different, not assessment, something more reflective. The last overlord, he said. I served under her directly. She was not what I expected either. He looked back at Izuku. She was young when she claimed the seat. Younger than she should have been, by the court standards of the time. She changed things. A pause. Not all of the changes were comfortable. Were they right? A long moment. Most of them. I'm going to change things too, Izuku said. And I'm going to do it with or without the court's cooperation, because the overlord's authority under the compact doesn't require the court's approval, it requires only the compact itself. But it would be significantly better for everyone involved if it happened with the court's cooperation. He held Kalen's gaze. Which is what I want to talk about. They talked for 3 hours. Kalen was not easy. He was rigorous and precise and pushed back on every point that wasn't fully substantiated, and twice he moved through arguments that were genuinely sophisticated enough to require Izuku to revise his position on the spot, which he did without defensiveness, integrating the correction and moving forward, and both times he saw something shift in Kalen's expression, something that might, in a different key, have been respect beginning to form its first tentative structures. Momo wasn't present for the meeting, but she'd prepared Izuku for it with 6 hours of strategic briefing over the past week, and her preparation was present in every exchange, the framing, the sequencing, the specific points where she'd told him they'll push here, hold this line, give on that one because it costs you nothing. She'd been right about every single one. At midnight, Kalen stood. The court will want a formal proposal, he said. Written, specific, citing the relevant compact provisions. It'll be ready in 10 days, Izuku said. The court will review in 14. 7, Izuku said. Another pause. 10. Done, Izuku said, which had been Momo's exact prediction, offer 7, they'll counter 10, take it, that's what you wanted anyway. Kalen looked at him. You had help preparing for this. I have people, Izuku said. Exceptional people. That's going to continue to be relevant going forward. The bonded humans, Kalen said, and again the neutrality that held the potential for something less. My people, Izuku said, and his voice was entirely level and entirely clear. You'll want to adjust how you're thinking about that category before the formal presentation, because how the court approaches them is going to be part of what we discuss. Kalen held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved in those ancient silver eyes, not threat, not challenge, the specific quality of someone reconsidering the terms of a situation they thought they understood. Understood, he said. He turned and walked back toward the gallery stairs without another word, and at the base of the stairs he paused, not looking back. For what it's worth, he said, you are more than I expected. A beat. That assessment goes in my report to the court. He went up the stairs and out through the roof hatch, and the concert hall was quiet. Jiro let out a long breath. He meant that. I know, Izuku said. He's not the enemy, she said. It wasn't quite a question. He's the complication, he said. Which is different. She looked at him. Momo's going to be obnoxiously right about all of her predictions when we debrief tomorrow. I know. I'm going to have to tell her that. She'll receive it gracefully. That's what's obnoxious about it, Jiro said. The attack came 4 days later. Not from Kalen. Not from the Pale Court's formal structure, this was something that bypassed both, which was worse in some ways and more understandable in others. 3 days after the concert hall meeting, Momo's research had uncovered a faction within the court that Kalen hadn't mentioned, a splinter group, for members, old and conservative and specifically hostile to the concept of a human-born overlord. They hadn't attended the formal sessions in decades. They operated on the fringe of the court's governance structure, technically within it, practically autonomous. They had apparently decided that the fastest solution to the problem of an overlord they didn't want was to remove the overlord's leverage before the formal presentation could happen. They came from Momo and Jiro on a Tuesday afternoon. Izuku was in a theory lecture on the north side of campus when it started. He felt it before Jiro's alert came through, felt it the way you feel a sudden cold in a warm room, the bond pulling sharp and urgent, and he was out of his seat before he consciously parsed what the sensation meant. Professor Ectoplasm looked up from the board. Midoriya, he was already out the door. He ran. Not at full speed, he would have destroyed the hallway at full speed, but close enough that the students he passed registered him as a blur and a rush of displaced air. His phone buzzed in his pocket, Jiro's contact, and he answered without stopping. Training Facility B, she said, and her voice was controlled, operationally flat, the voice she used when things were going wrong and panic wasn't an option. 4 of them. They were waiting inside. They hit us when we came in for the 3 p.m. session. How bad? Momo's down. She's breathing, a brief pause, the sound of something sharp and fast, Jiro's sonar going active at full power, she hit the wall hard, something's wrong with her left side. And you? I'm fine. I'm better than fine, actually. He heard something in her voice that was neither fear nor confidence but the specific frequency between them, the one that meant she had just discovered a new capability under pressure and was processing it while fighting. These things are old. Really old. They move differently than anything I've trained against. He hit the stairwell at the bottom of the building and went down 3 steps at a time, and the training block was across the east quad, and he crossed the quad in 8 seconds, which was fast enough that 2 students watching from a window would later describe it as something dark moving across the grass. He came through the training facility B door without slowing and took the room in a single sweep. 4 figures, as Jiro had said. Old, he could feel the age of them, the dense compressed weight of centuries, the kind of presence that registered before visual identification. They were not the careful, precise variety of old that Kalen was. They were the other kind, the kind that age had made rigid, armored in certainty, their capabilities all pointed in one direction for so long that they'd lost the flexibility that made someone genuinely dangerous. Jiro was in the center of the room in a defensive position, sonar active, using the facility's steel columns as acoustic amplifiers for her attacks in a way that was extraordinary, actually, the adaptation so precise and creative that he noted it even in the 0.6 of a second he had before the assessment needed to become action. Momo was against the far wall. Sitting up, which meant conscious, but her left arm was held at a careful angle that meant she was protecting it, and the line of her jaw was tight in the way it got when she was managing significant pain. She had created a barrier with her right hand, 5 layers of composite material, each one engineered for maximum tensile strength, stacked between herself and the room. Her eyes found him the instant he entered and the quality of her expression shifted, not relief exactly, something more specific than relief. She held up her right hand and her index finger pointed, very precisely, at the figure closest to him. That one first. He moved. The nearest figure had a half-second to register his entrance before he was inside their guard and it was already over for that particular exchange. He didn't use one for all, it wasn't necessary. The vampiric strength alone was sufficient and more controlled, and he dropped the first figure with a force that was enough and no more, not punishing, just final. The second turned toward him and he redirected the momentum rather than meeting it, and the redirection used their own speed against them in a way that put them through Momo's composite barrier which they hadn't been intended to go through and which Momo, he suspected from the fractional timing, had engineered specifically to receive them. The third and fourth regrouped. They were communicating without words, old enough that the coordination was structural, the kind that came from centuries of fighting together. They split wide, tried to take flanking angles, and Izuku stood in the center of the room and watched them come. He could hear Jiro repositioning behind him, moving to his left, covering his blind side without being asked. The 2 remaining figures came at him simultaneously from angles that would have been difficult for most things to manage. He managed both. The third he stopped with one hand, a grip on the wrist that allowed no further movement, and the contact delivered the same thing he delivered to the enhanced creature in the sublevel 2 months ago, the simple, direct command, stop, applied not with words but with something native to what he was, and it worked, the figure going rigid and then dropping. The fourth figure reached Jiro before Izuku could redirect. He saw it happen. Saw the calculation the fourth figure made, Izuku occupied, Jiro exposed for 3 seconds, the bonded human was the leverage point, take the leverage and the Overlord negotiates from a different position. It was, tactically, the correct read of the room from their perspective. They grabbed Jiro. Izuku went very still. The temperature in the room dropped. Not metaphorically, actually, measurably, the ambient temperature in training facility B fell approximately 4 degrees in under 2 seconds. Jiro, to her credit, didn't panic, she drove her jack plug into the figure's hand at close range and delivered a focused sonic burst that made the grip loosen fractionally, and in that fraction she angled her body away from the facility's central columns, clearing his line. The stillness in Izuku became something else. It wasn't rage, exactly. Rage was too diffuse for what this was. This was the specific, absolute, zero-temperature certainty of something that had decided what was going to happen next and was moving toward it with complete commitment. He crossed the room and the fourth figure looked up, and the eyes they met were not the careful deep green of his normal range, they were something older and colder and significantly more direct. He put his hand on the figure's shoulder. "Let her go," he said. The voice was quiet. No performance in it, no warning tone, just the flat, enormous weight of something that wasn't giving a request. The figure let her go. "Now sit down," he said, and they sat, the same way the enhanced creature had sat 3 months ago, the same way everything sat when he said sit down, with the full authority of what he was behind it. The room was very quiet. He looked at Jiro first. She was shaken, she had it controlled, but the specific quality of her heartbeat told him she was managing the aftermath of fear, the retroactive shock that arrives after the action has resolved. She met his eyes and her jaw was tight, and she said, "I'm fine," and he heard the truth of it underneath the management. He went to Momo. She let him examine the arm without protest, which told him the pain was significant enough that her usual composure around physical vulnerability had been overridden. He assessed the damage with his hands and his hearing. The bone was intact, the shoulder had been wrenched, significant soft tissue damage. Not the worst he'd seen her take, but enough. "We need medical," he said. "Recovery girl," Momo said, with the precise, managed calm she used when she was in considerable pain and refusing to let it run her. "Don't take me to the general medical team. Recovery girl only." "Why?" he said. "Because she already knows." Momo met his eyes. "She figured it out from the blood work and came to me last week. She's not going to ask complicated questions about how 4 vampires got into the training facility." He looked at her. "You're telling me Recovery Girl knows and is on our side?" "Recovery Girl," Momo said, "told me that in 60 years of doing this job she had suspected this day would come, and she was very glad she'd made good decisions about whose side she was on. Despite everything, despite the 4 unconscious figures on the training facility floor and the adrenaline residue and Jiro's barely managed shock and Momo's pain, something happened in his chest that was almost laughter. "Okay," he said. "Recovery girl." He helped Momo up and she leaned on him without comment, her right hand gripping his forearm, her left held carefully against her body. Jiro came in on Momo's other side without being asked, and the 3 of them moved toward the facility door, and Izuku stopped once to look back at the 4 figures on the floor. "What do we do with them?" Jiro said. "I'll deal with it," he said. "Kalen," she said. "Kalen," he confirmed. "This happened outside the court's authority and he needs to know that. This is also going to determine whether he's who I think he is." "You think he didn't authorize this?" Momo said, her voice slightly strained. "I think he'd have used a completely different approach if he wanted leverage," Izuku said. "I think the faction that did this moved without his knowledge. And I think when I tell him about it he's going to be," he paused. "Furious," Jiro said. "Significantly unhappy," Izuku agreed. He looked at the 4 figures on the floor one more time, not angry, not triumphant, just clear. "These 4 tried to take leverage by touching people who are mine." His voice was completely level. "The court is going to understand that that is not a strategy that has any positive outcomes before the formal presentation happens. That's the message Kalen delivers." Momo looked at him. "And if the court doesn't receive the message well, then the presentation is going to go very differently than they want it to," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, reading him, as she always read him, with the complete attention of someone who heard both the words and the truth beneath them. Whatever she found there settled something in her expression, the kind of settling that happened when a well-built thing proves it's built well. "Recovery girl," she said. "And then you call Kalen." "And then I call Kalen," he agreed. "And then," Jiro said, "you're going to tell us how you dropped the temperature in that room 4 degrees because that was," she paused, searching. "Impressive," Momo said, with the directness of someone who had no patience for false modesty in either direction. I was going to say terrifying, Jiro said. But yes. Also impressive. He got them to Recovery Girl. The old healer looked at all three of them over the tops of her glasses, assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds, and said, "Sit down, close the door, and start from the beginning." Momo's shoulder began healing under that small, warm quirk, and Jiro sat beside her with her jacks retracted, the adrenaline finally releasing into something quieter. Izuku stepped outside the door and sent a message to one contact only. The Splinter faction moved. 4 of them. They came for my bonded. Everyone is safe. Come to the coordinates I'll send in 1 hour. Kalen's response arrived in 40 seconds. On my way. Izuku looked at the message. He'd been right about Kalen, or right enough. The speed of the response, the absence of any defensive framing, the complete lack of negotiation about whether or not to come, these were not the responses of someone who'd known about the attack. He sent the coordinates and went back inside. Recovery Girl was telling Momo something in a low, emphatic voice that had the quality of someone delivering a prepared speech that had been waiting for the right moment, and Momo was listening with the expression she wore when information was landing that was going to rearrange several of her existing models. Jiro had her head back against the wall, eyes closed, jack extended at a low relaxed angle, the specific posture she used when she was processing with the sound rather than fighting it. She opened her eyes when he came back in. Momo's going to be fine, she said. I know. She's going to want to debrief the entire fight sequence tactically the moment Recovery Girl clears her. I know that too. Jiro looked at him. You went very cold in that room. He met her eyes. The question underneath was real and she was asking it directly, which was exactly how she asked things. I know, he said. Is that something we need to understand? Or manage? He thought about the temperature drop, the quality of the stillness that had preceded it. He thought about the fourth figure's hand on Jiro's arm and the specific thing that had happened inside him in response. Understand, he said. Not manage. He looked at her steadily. When you or Momo or Midnight are threatened, when someone touches you with intent to harm, what happens in me isn't anger. Anger has temperature. That had none. A pause. I'll always be able to make it stop on command. But I won't apologize for what it is. She held his gaze. Good, she said, simply. He sat down on the bench beside her and she leaned against his shoulder without ceremony, without making it significant, just, present, the natural ease of someone who had arrived at a proximity and found it correct. He stayed still and let the quiet of the recovery room settle around them. Outside the window, the UA campus moved through its afternoon routines, entirely unaware that in Training Facility B the Pale Court Splinter faction had tried their move and found what was waiting for them, and that somewhere across the city an 8-century-old enforcer was moving toward coordinates with the specific speed of someone who had just received information that changed everything. And in the recovery room, with Momo's shoulder healing and Jiro's sonar quietly mapping the building and Recovery Girl muttering to herself in the next alcove, Izuku Midoriya sat and breathed, and a bond hummed in his chest, 3 specific, distinct, irreplaceable frequencies, and it was warm, and it was certain, and it was entirely his. Chapter 6, The Crimson Throne. The formal presentation was set for a Friday. 10 days after the concert hall meeting with Kalen, 6 days after the attack in Training Facility B, 3 days after Kalen had arrived at the recovery room coordinates and stood in the doorway looking at 4 unconscious members of the court's Splinter faction with an expression that was the most controlled fury Izuku had ever seen on a human face, or a face that had once been human. He hadn't apologized. Izuku hadn't expected him to. What Kalen had done instead was stand in that doorway for approximately 40 seconds, looking at the 4 figures with those ancient silver eyes doing something complicated and cold, and then said, I'll handle the court's internal response. This won't happen again. No, Izuku agreed. It won't. Kalen had looked at him then, a full assessment, the kind that recalculated from first principles. The presentation stands. Yes. The court will be difficult. I know, Izuku said. I'm not concerned. Kalen had left with the 4 splinter members and said nothing else, and Izuku had told Momo about the exchange the next morning while her shoulder finished the last of its healing, and Momo had said he's decided whose side he's on, in the tone she used for conclusions that were complete. The 10 days between had been preparation. Momo had written the formal proposal in 3 drafts, each one incorporating Midnight's operational framing and Izuku's understanding of the compact, a layered document that cited ancient provisions with precise references and proposed changes with the specific language that gave the court no clean angle of refusal. It was the best piece of strategic writing Izuku had ever read, and he told her so directly, and she received it with the composure of someone who knew it was excellent and didn't need the confirmation but was glad for it anyway. Midnight had mapped every known court member's history and power base. She'd done it with the same systematic completeness she brought to every problem, working from Momo's research and her own contacts and 3 sources that she declined to identify and that Izuku decided not to push her on. The result was a 12-page operational intelligence document that told him exactly who in that room was persuadable, who was fixed, who followed power, and who followed principle. Jiro had spent 10 days learning the formal presentation venue, a location Kalen had designated, somewhere in the city's deep underground that had been a court chamber for 400 years. She'd mapped it acoustically from the 2 site visits they'd been permitted, building a sound profile so complete that she could track every person in that room simultaneously and feed him real-time intelligence during the presentation through a frequency too low for most people to consciously register. He'd hear it as sensation, a gentle pressure, directional, that would tell him where the attention in the room was moving before he could see it. It was, he thought, exactly what it was supposed to be. 4 people, each complete, each contributing something irreplaceable, building something together that none of them could build alone. The morning of the presentation, Midnight came to find him. Not the Thursday session format, not operational. She came to the dormitory at 7 in the morning and knocked on his door, and when he opened it she was in her civilian clothes with her hair down, and her expression had the quality it had when she'd been thinking about something through the night and had arrived somewhere. He stepped back from the door. She came in and stood in the middle of his room, the notes everywhere, the large notebook on the desk, the same organized chaos it had always been, and looked at him. "Today's complicated," she said. "Yes. You're presenting to an ancient governing body of vampires that has spent 2,000 years without an overlord, 3 members of which tried to take your leverage last week, and you're doing it with 3 bonded humans and a formal proposal that's going to restructure their entire governance framework." "That's accurate," he said. "So I want to say this before it starts." She looked at him with the direct, unperformed quality that he'd been watching her find more access to over the past weeks, the real Nemuri more present in more moments, the performance more often a choice than a necessity. "I've been thinking about what you said. In the office, the first time." A pause. "And what you said in my apartment. And everything after." He waited. "I've been thinking about it very carefully," she said, "because I don't do things badly when I decide to do them. I'm thorough. I assess. I make sure I understand what I'm choosing before I choose it." She held his gaze. "And I understand what I'm choosing." The morning light was coming through his window at a low angle and it fell across her face, and she stood in it with her arms loose at her sides, completely herself, the armor fully down, just Nemuri Kayama in a dormitory room at 7 in the morning having decided something. "Tell me," he said. "I'm choosing this," she said. "You. What this is. What it's going to be." A slight pause. "I'm choosing it with full information and clear eyes and the specific understanding that I am not a convenient addition to something else." She said it in his own words, and the deliberateness of that was precise and entirely her. "I want that to be said out loud, on the record, before today, so it isn't something that happens in the aftermath of something else. So it's its own thing." He looked at her for a moment. 7 in the morning, presentation in 5 hours, the pale court at the end of the day, and she had come here first, specifically to make this its own thing, untangled from the events around it. "Kayama-san," he said. "Nemuri," she said. "If you're going to say yes, use my name." "Nemuri," he said. It fit. Yes. She nodded once, with the clean finality of someone completing a transaction they've been working toward for a while. Then she said, now. The bond. Now. Before the presentation. I want to go into that room as what I am, not as something in between. Her eyes were steady. I've watched what it did for Momo and Jiro. I know what it is. I'm not going into the most important negotiation of your life as a maybe. He held her gaze. You've thought about this. Thoroughly, she said. As established. He moved toward her, and she didn't step back. She never stepped back from things she'd decided on, and when he reached her he was slower than he'd been with the others because she'd asked for time and this was her time and he wasn't going to rush a single second of it. He looked at her face, the angular, striking lines of it, the sharp intelligence behind the dark eyes, the woman who had spent 20 years being midnight for the world and was standing here being just herself. He put his hand against her jaw the same way he had with Momo, and she closed her eyes, and when the bond came it was different from both of the others. It came in fast and total, like a door thrown open rather than unlocked, because Namuri Kayama didn't do things by degrees once she'd decided, and the warmth of it hit her with an intensity that made her breath catch once, sharply, before settling. She opened her eyes. They were different. Not in color, the dark stayed dark, but in depth, in the quality of what lived behind them. She blinked twice, adjusting, and he watched her recalibrate with the speed of someone who had spent their career adapting to new information under pressure. Oh, she said. The same word Momo had said. He suspected that was going to become a thing. Give it a moment, he said. She held up one hand and looked at it, and then she breathed out a fine mist of lavender-tinted air, her quirk, the soporific pheromones, but the concentration of it even in that small, unintended breath was significantly higher than her baseline. She looked at it with the specific expression of a professional confronting a capability upgrade. That's going to need calibration, she said. Yes. My fine control was already exceptional. It's going to be better, he said. Give yourself the day to adjust the sensitivity before you use it on anyone. She looked at him. I know how to manage my own quirk. I know you do, he said. I'm saying it because I said the same thing to both of them and they both appreciated it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then, what did Jiro say? She told me she knew how to manage her own quirk. The corner of Namuri's mouth moved. Good girl. He smiled. She registered the smile with the specific quality she'd been registering his smiles with since the office, and now didn't look away from it. Go get ready, he said. We leave at 11. She moved toward the door. At the threshold she stopped and turned back, and the look she gave him was brief and complete, everything she'd said, confirmed again in a single look, and then she was gone. He stood in his room for a moment in the morning light. For frequencies in his chest now. For specific, irreplaceable warmths, each one distinct, Momo's sharp and considered, Jiro's resonant and honest, Namuri's immediate and absolute. All of them his, all of them whole, all of them present as he turned toward the day. He picked up his notebook. Made a note. Closed it. The pale quartz chamber was exactly what Jiro's acoustic mapping had described and nothing her mapping had fully prepared them for. It was underground, far underground, beneath a building in the city's old district that had been rebuilt 3 times over the centuries while this chamber remained constant beneath it. The approach was through a corridor that had been cut from the original bedrock, torchlit in the theatrical way of institutions that understood the architecture of intimidation, and the corridor was long enough that by the time you emerged into the chamber proper you'd had 60 seconds to feel small. Izuku walked through it at a comfortable pace, Momo on his left and Namuri on his right, Jiro slightly behind and to his left, Jax extended, already feeding him the room's acoustic geometry and low pulses of directional pressure. The corridor's intimidation architecture did nothing to any of them. Momo walked with the contained, upright energy of someone whose tactical map was complete. Namuri walked like she owned the corridor. Jiro walked like the corridor was a musical instrument and she was deciding whether to play it. The chamber opened before them. It was enormous, 30 meters wide, ceiling vaulted and dark above, lit by that same torch arrangement along the walls. At the far end, a curved dais where 7 high-backed seats were arranged, 6 of them occupied, 1 empty. The pale court, minus the 4 splinter members who were, as of 4 days ago, no longer court members by Kalen's authority and the compact provisions Momo had cited to him. 6 figures. Ancient, composed, dressed in the formal severity of a governing body that had operated with unquestioned authority for 2 millennia. They looked at the 4 people walking toward them with the specific quality of people who were accustomed to observing and being very rarely observed in return. On the floor of the chamber, standing to the left of the dais in a position that was formal but not elevated, not seated with the court, not floor level with the visitors, was Kalen. He was in the same dark, light-absorbing clothing, and he held himself with the specific neutrality of someone whose job today was to be neither court nor overlord but the space between them. He looked at Izuku as they entered and gave the smallest possible nod. Acknowledgement without allegiance. Izuku walked to the center of the chamber floor and stopped. He did not bow. There was no hesitation about this, not defiance, not performance, just the natural comportment of someone who understood exactly where they stood. The Overlord's position under the compact was not supplicant. He stood on the floor of the chamber and looked at the 6 seated figures and waited for the room to settle into its own silence. The silence arrived. The court's de facto senior, a woman who looked perhaps 60 and was, Midnight's research indicated, closer to 900, looked at Izuku with eyes that had the same cold silver as Kalen's but older, the silver thinned to something that was almost white. Her name was Serafini. She had run the day-to-day governance of the court for 400 years and had survived every political crisis in that period by being, according to Midnight sources, the most patient and least emotionally available person in any room she occupied. She looked at Izuku the way she probably looked at everything, with the long, slow assessment of something that measured in centuries. "The Overlord presents," she said. Her voice was a perfect instrument, trained for exactly this room. "The Overlord presents," he agreed. "The court recognizes the activation of the seat. The compact holds." She let that land for a moment. "We have read the formal proposal submitted through Kalen's office. The court has reviewed. In 7 days, Izuku said. As agreed. In 7 days, she acknowledged. The court has reactions. I expect so, he said. Something moved through the assembled court members at the simplicity of that, not quite discomfort, the specific quality of people encountering a register they hadn't prepared for. 6 members of a governing body that had operated on the assumption that any overlord, arriving after 2,000 years, would be deferential, uncertain, grateful for their continuity and their institutional knowledge. The person standing on the chamber floor was none of those things. Serafini looked at him for a long moment. The proposal restructures the court's oversight authority, she said. Yes. Significantly. Yes. It eliminates the court's autonomous authority over hidden world enforcement, said one of the other members, a man, broadly built, whose name Midnight's research had listed as Vorn, 8 centuries old, the court's primary enforcement theorist, and a reliable ally of Serafini's in most votes. It transfers that authority to the Overlord's office, Izuku said. Where the compact always placed it. The court's autonomous authority over enforcement is a 2,000-year-old administrative drift, not a compact provision. Page 7 of the proposal, citations 14 through 19. Vorn looked at him. You're very young. Page 7, Izuku said pleasantly. Citations 14 through 19. Jiro sent him a directional pulse, 2 taps, which meant second from the left, attention moving. The second from the left was a woman named Thessaly, who was the youngest member of the court at a mere 4 centuries and whom Midnight's research had marked as the court's most reform-adjacent member, the one most likely to peel from the block if the argument was made correctly. Her attention was forward and her body language had the specific quality of someone who was doing math. The proposal also, Serafini continued, addresses the status of the Overlord's bonded humans. In considerable detail. Yes, Izuku said. The compact has no precedent for bonded humans at the Overlord level, she said. The last Overlord had no such bonds. The compact also has no prohibition, Momo said. The room looked at her. She stood on Izuku's left with the complete ease of someone who had been prepared for this moment and found it exactly as described. Her voice in the chamber was clear and carried precisely, the natural result of someone who'd spent 3 years learning to command rooms. Page 12, she said. The compact's language on the Overlord's household is permissive, not restrictive. It establishes rights and protections for those the Overlord claims. It doesn't specify a category. She looked at Serafini. The absence of precedent isn't a prohibition. It's a gap. The proposal closes the gap explicitly. Serafini looked at Momo for a long moment. You prepared this document. I contributed to it, Momo said. Significantly, Serafini said. It was not quite a compliment and not quite not a compliment. Yes, Momo said. Vorn looked at Nemuri. You're a pro-hero. I am, Nemuri said. Active duty. Yes. The proposal suggests that the Overlord's household operating within existing hero society, without disclosure to that society's governing bodies, is sustainable, Nemuri said, and her voice had the specific quality it had in operational briefings, clean and precise and completely certain. I've been a pro-hero for 10 years. I understand both sides of this framework. The proposal's non-disclosure provisions are practical and precedent. The hidden world has coexisted with hero society for the entire modern era. This formalizes that coexistence rather than disrupting it. And your professional obligations, Vorn said, to the hero bodies you report to, are being managed, she said, in a tone that closed the subject. Jiro sent him 3 pulses, third from right, resistant, watching the exchange closely. Third from right was the one named Aldrich. Oldest member after Serafini. The research had flagged him as the most conservative, the most likely to resist any proposal that moved authority away from the court structure, and also the most likely to respond to a direct power demonstration over an argument. Izuku looked at Aldrich. He had been listening to the exchanges with his hands folded and his expression giving nothing, but underneath the composure was the specific quality of someone who had made their decision before walking in and was waiting for the proceedings to reach the point where it became relevant. He held Izuku's gaze with the weight of 9 centuries. The compact provides, Aldrich said, and his voice had the specific deliberateness of someone deploying a prepared statement, that the Overlord, upon presenting to the court, shall demonstrate the activation's legitimacy through the proving. The proposal does not address the proving. A silence. Kalen, from his position to the left of the dais, made no movement. The proving, Izuku said. An ancient rite, Aldrich said. Predating the current compact structure. The Overlord demonstrates the seat's activation is genuine through a direct trial before the court. The last proving was 2,000 years ago. The compact you cited is the founding compact, Momo said, from beside Izuku. Article 3, the proving provision, was conditionally suspended in the secondary compact of the 7th century pending the seat's reactivation. She looked at Aldrich. Page 15 of our proposal, citation 23. The suspension was Kalen's authority to invoke or waive. Every eye in the room went to Kalen. He had been still throughout the entire proceedings, the controlled stillness of 8 centuries. He looked at Aldrich and then at Serafini and then at Izuku, and his expression was doing something that Izuku could read now, not easily, not completely, but the shape of it. He had known this was coming. He had known Aldrich would invoke the proving. He had known about the suspension provision and the authority question. He had prepared. The proving, Kalen said, speaking for the first time since the proceedings began, is waived. Aldrich's composure moved for the first time. On whose authority? On the authority of the Enforcer's Office, Kalen said, which holds the conditional suspension. And on the basis that the activation's legitimacy is not in question. He looked at the assembled court and his voice had the quality Izuku was beginning to understand was his genuine register, not the measured neutrality of the formal setting but something older and more certain. I was at the perimeter. I was in the concert hall. I sat in this chamber's anteroom and read the proposal that this office produced in 10 days. The activation is genuine. The seat is occupied by someone who, he paused, and chose the next words with visible deliberateness, who is more than adequate to occupy it. From Kalen, that was an endorsement. Aldrich sat back. His jaw was tight but his options had just compressed significantly, and he was old enough to know when a line of argument had reached its end. Serafini looked at the assembled court. Something was happening in the room's political geometry. Jiro was feeding Izuku the directional data in pulses, and he could feel the current of it, the way Thessaly had moved from math to conclusion, the way two of the quieter members had shifted from waiting to arrived. The block was fracturing along exactly the lines Midnight's research had predicted. Serafini looked at Izuku. He held her gaze. The proposal, she said, requires the court's approval by majority. Formal vote. Yes, he said. She looked at the assembled members. The court will vote. The vote was not a certainty. It had never been a certainty. 3 of the 6 had been genuinely undecided going in, Aldrich was fixed against, and even Serafini's position had been, according to Midnight's research, probably yes but contingent on how the room moved. The room had moved the way it had moved because of Momo's citations and Nimuri's operational precision and Kalen's endorsement and the specific quality of Izuku himself standing on the floor of the chamber and being entirely what he was without apology or management. Thessaly voted yes. 2 of the undecided members voted yes. Serafini voted yes. Vorn, after a pause that lasted 4 full seconds, voted yes. Aldrich voted no. 5-1. The chamber was quiet. Serafini looked at the result with the specific equanimity of someone who had managed institutional decisions for 4 centuries. The proposal passes, she said. The Overlord's authority over enforcement is restored to compact provision. The status of the Overlord's household is formalized per the proposal's terms. The Pale Court acknowledges. She looked at Izuku. The Overlord is recognized, she said. And then, with the weight of something that had been 2,000 years in arriving, the throne is occupied. They came out of the underground at dusk. Not the same dusk as this morning, a different one, denser and colder, the city's lights coming on as the sky moved from blue to black above the buildings. Izuku stood on the street outside the building's unremarkable entrance and breathed the outside air and felt the city's sound and smell and detail wash over him in the particular way it did now, everything present and specific. Momo stood beside him, looking at the street with the particular expression she had when a complex operation had resolved correctly and she was taking a moment to register it before moving to the next thing. Her left shoulder was fully healed, her posture its usual clean uprightness, and she turned to look at him with those deep, precisely attentive eyes. 5-1, she said. 5-1, he agreed. Aldrich will be difficult in the ongoing governance work. Yes. He's also predictable, she said. Predictably resistant is easier to plan around than unpredictably resistant. She paused. I'll start mapping the secondary governance framework tonight. The enforcement transition alone is going to require, Momo, he said. She stopped. Tonight, he said, you don't map anything. She looked at him with the expression she used when she was determining whether to argue. He held her gaze. Tomorrow, he said. I promise the secondary governance framework will still need mapping tomorrow. A pause. Then the specific exhale she used when conceding a point she found reasonable. Tomorrow, she agreed. Jiro was leaning against the building wall with her jacks retracted, looking at the sky in the way she looked at things she was composing in her head. She had the distant, inward expression of someone whose mind was organizing sound into something. She felt his attention and came back into the present without quite leaving the internal thing. That room had incredible acoustics, she said. I know, he said. You were brilliant in there. She looked at him. You couldn't hear the feed. I could feel the feed. The direction and timing were perfect. He held her gaze. Every move I made in that room was informed by what you were telling me. Every one of them. She looked away, which was what she did when something landed that she didn't want to receive gracefully in front of witnesses. Her mouth was doing the almost smile thing. The chamber goes back to the 2nd century, she said, to the sky. The acoustic geometry is intentional. Someone designed that space specifically to intimidate through sound. A pause. I'll figure out how to reverse it. I know you will, he said. Namuri was a few steps away, on her phone, finishing a call in the clipped tones she used with Hero Agency contacts. She ended it and came back to the group with the specific energy of someone whose operational mode was winding down into something more personal, the transition she'd been making more fluidly over the past weeks. Recovery girl knows the vote went through, she said. She says, and I'm quoting, about time. Jiro made a sound that was a suppressed laugh. My agency contact wants a brief on the Pale Court situation, Namuri continued. I've been managing the information tightly, but we're going to need a trusted disclosure eventually. She looked at Izuku. I have thoughts on how to approach that. Thursday, he said. Thursday, she agreed. She looked at him then with the quality she'd had in his doorway this morning, the real Namuri in full, and something warm moved through the bond that was specific to her frequency, immediate and total, the way she did everything. You were, she started. Impressive, Momo said. Terrifying, Jiro said, still looking at the sky. I was going to say exactly what you needed to be, Namuri said, to Izuku, in a tone that made both impressive and terrifying irrelevant. He looked at her. So were you, he said. All 3 of you. The street was quiet around them, the ordinary evening current of the city moving past, people going home, lights coming on in windows, the specific texture of a world that had no idea what had just been decided in the chamber beneath their feet. The Pale Court, restructured. The Overlord's authority, restored. 2,000 years of administrative drift, corrected in a single vote. The hidden world had changed tonight. Not loudly, not visibly, quietly, structurally, the way the most permanent changes always happened. And 4 people were standing on a street in Mizutafu knowing it, and none of them were performing how they felt about it. Izuku looked at the 3 of them. Momo with her tablet already half out of her bag despite everything, the pull of the next problem already working on her. Jiro with the sky and the city's sound architecture and something being composed in her head. Namuri with her phone put away and her arms loose at her sides and the specific quality of someone who had arrived somewhere after a long transit and found it worth the journey. Where do you want to go, he said. Not a grand question, just that. Where do you want to go tonight? Momo said, somewhere with good food. My body has been processing an extraordinary amount of adrenaline for 2 weeks and I require actual nutrition. Jiro said, somewhere quiet. Or somewhere with live music. One of those. Namuri said, I know a place. Both. Good food, live music, quiet enough to hear it. She looked at Momo. They do an exceptional set menu. Momo considered this. Evaluated and accepted. Jiro pushed off the wall. Lead the way. Namuri started walking, and the rest of them fell in around her, and the city did what cities did, absorbed them, moved around them, went on being the enormous ordinary thing it was while 4 people walked through it carrying the weight of an extraordinary thing and wearing it comfortably. Izuku walked and listened to the city with his full range, every heartbeat, every conversation, every specific human frequency of the 10,000 people within his current sensory field. The habit of 3 years of heroics training, now running on entirely different hardware. He still noticed everything. He always had. He noticed more now. He noticed Momo's hand brush his arm when they turned a corner, a small, natural gesture, nothing announced. He noticed Jiro falling into step beside him with the ease of someone who'd been doing it for years and had simply stopped pretending she hadn't. He noticed Nemuri glance back at him over her shoulder with the look she'd been giving him since the office meeting and had finally stopped packaging as anything other than what it was. He noticed all of it and held it, each specific frequency, each irreplaceable warmth. The restaurant was where Nemuri said it would be, small, warm, lit in the amber register of places that understood the difference between bright and welcoming. The music was a single guitarist in the corner working through something finger-picked and unhurried, and Jiro tilted her head toward it the instant they walked in, cataloging. The food was excellent, which Momo established within 3 bites and communicated through a subtle but unmistakable shift in her posture. They sat for 3 hours. They talked about the vote and about Kalen and about the secondary governance work and about Aizawa, whom they had collectively decided needed the full picture within the week and who would receive it with the same flat, exhausted, all-knowing quality he brought to most revelations. They talked about things that weren't the Pale Court, Jiro's parents' label, Momo's reading list, Nemuri's genuinely remarkable series of opinions about hero agency bureaucracy that were both scathing and accurate. He told them about the dark. He hadn't told them all of it before, had told them the structure of it, the negotiation, the entity and the offer. But he told them now about the specific quality of the warmth in it, the ancientness, the way it had said you always have a notebook, and he'd known it was the truest thing anyone had ever said to him. Momo listened with the complete attention she always gave things that mattered. Jiro was very still, hearing the emotional frequencies underneath the words. Nemuri looked at him with the expression she had when something was landing that was reorganizing her existing model. "It knew you," Momo said. "Better than I knew myself at the time," he said. "Not better," Jiro said quietly. "It just knew what was there without the noise." She looked at him. "That's different." He looked at her. "All the doubt," she said. "All the compensating. All the years of running twice as hard because you started without a quirk. That's noise. What's underneath it was always there. A beat. The dark entity didn't give you something new. It just cleared the channel." The table was quiet for a moment. Nemuri picked up her glass. "I'm going to note," she said, "that Jiro said that, and it was the most precise thing said tonight, and the most precise thing said tonight was said by someone who claims to be bad at feelings." "I'm not bad at feelings," Jiro said flatly. "I'm bad at performing feelings. There's a difference. You should know the difference." Deeply and personally, Nemuri agreed. Momo looked between them with the specific expression of someone observing a dynamic they find both accurate and mildly amusing. Then she looked at Izuku. "What happens next?" "Governance transition," he said. "The enforcement authority handover will take time. The Kalen relationship needs cultivation. He's going to be the most useful person in the hidden world if we get that right, and the most complicated problem if we don't." He paused. "Aizawa. The school year. Exams." Jiro said, "Exams," with the specific intonation of someone who had briefly forgotten about exams and was now recalling them with displeasure. "And," he said, "figuring out the next 100 things I don't know about what I am." He looked around the table. "Which I'm doing with you. All of you." He held it for a moment, the 4 of them in the amber light with the unhurried guitar from the corner and the city doing its thing outside the window. "None of that is a solo project." "No," Momo agreed. "It isn't." "Obviously not," Nemuri said. Jiro said nothing, but her hand moved under the table and her fingers found his wrist and stayed there, a small, unceremonious anchor, and that was Jiro, no announcement, no performance, just the clean honest truth of it. They stayed until the guitarist finished his set and the restaurant began its quiet wind down, and they walked back through the city toward campus in the cold, and the night was clear enough for stars above the city's light. Momo pointed out a constellation with the precise academic enthusiasm she brought to things that interested her. Nemuri said something dry about the constellation's mythology that made Jiro make the suppressed laugh sound twice in a row. Izuku walked through the middle of all of it and felt the frequencies of them, for distinct warmths in his chest, and the city breathed around them and the night was enormous and the world was different than it had been a month ago. Different in every way that mattered. He had died in a sublevel. He had come back as something the world had no category for. He had found, in the process, that the things worth keeping about himself were the things that had always been there, the noticing, the caring, the specific refusal to stop reaching for the notebook, and that those things, given room to be fully themselves, were the foundation of something no one was going to move. The throne was occupied. Not in the underground chamber, in the street, in the amber restaurant light, in a dormitory at 7 in the morning and a rooftop at midnight. In the acoustic map of a concert hall and the 12 pages of a governance proposal and the specific way a hand finds a wrist in the dark and stays. Here. In the warmth of 4 frequencies humming in his chest. Here was where it was.